In the mysterious twilight, when the day's hustle and bustle yield to the quiet of night, we will delve into the depths of ancient Greek legends, where heroic deeds intertwine with divine intrigues. Allow yourself to step away from the everyday and prepare for a journey into a world where myths come alive. There is something captivating about stories that have survived for centuries. They carry the echoes of ancient times, the whispers of campfires, and the steady rhythm of voices that pass these tales from generation to generation. Today we will witness the remarkable journey of one of the greatest heroes, from his first breath to his last, most incredible trial. Dim the lights, create a cozy atmosphere, and let the gentle background hum transport you to a distant past. Feel this moment. You stand on the streets of ancient Thebes beneath a warm summer sky. The air is thick with the aromas of olive oil and freshly baked bread. In a humble dwelling, a woman named Alcmene prepares to give birth to a child destined to become the most celebrated hero in all of Greek mythology. But this is not merely the story of a birth. It is the prelude to an epic saga that will recount 12 impossible labours. And it all begins with the tangled love affairs of Zeus, the lord of Olympus. As is well known, Zeus's reputation was quite controversial. While his wife, Hera, reigned beside him atop Mount Olympus, the thunderer was infamous for his inconstancy. He would assume various guises and visit mortal women, leaving behind offspring, half human and half divine. These children, called demigods, often lived extraordinary lives, but over them always loomed the shadow of Hera's relentless jealousy. Alcmene was different from Zeus's other mortal paramours. She was known throughout Thebes for her impeccable virtue and unwavering loyalty to her husband, Amphitryon. However, Zeus, being Zeus, perceived this more as a challenge than an obstacle. One night, while Amphitryon was away on campaign, Zeus assumed the exact likeness of Alcmene's husband and appeared before her. Alcmene, believing it was indeed her beloved husband returning home early, greeted him with undisguised joy. That single night would change the course of their destinies forever. When the real Amphitryon returned the next day, Alcmene was utterly bewildered by his accounts of the previous evening, but by then it was too late. Zeus had had his way, and Alcmene soon discovered she was carrying the child of the king of the gods. Now imagine yourself a servant in that house, watching the months pass. You notice Alcmene's pregnancy seems unusual. The baby kicks with astonishing force. Strange dreams visit Alcmene's sleep. And on Mount Olympus, Hera gradually learns of her husband's latest infidelity. Hera's wrath was fueled not only by jealousy, though that certainly played its part. She was the goddess of marriage and family, and Zeus's constant intrigues were a personal affront to everything she represented. But this child would be special. Zeus had grand plans for him, and Hera simply could not allow it. The night of the birth arrives, and you feel a tension in the air, like the stillness before a storm. Alcmene's labor begins. But something is wrong. Hours pass, then more hours. The midwives whisper among themselves. The baby should have been born by now, but it is as if some invisible force is holding back the natural process. What Alcmene doesn't know is that on Mount Olympus, Hera has sent Eileithyia, the goddess of childbirth, to sit at Alcmene's door. Eileithyia sits, cross-legged, fingers interlocked, using her divine power to prevent the birth. It is an ancient form of magic, and it works flawlessly. But in these old stories, there is always someone clever. One of Alcmene's servants, a quick-witted woman named Galanthis, notices something strange about the stranger sitting at their door. This woman has been sitting there for hours, never moving, never speaking a word, just sitting in this peculiar posture. Galanthis realizes this might be divine interference. So Galanthis rushes out and cries joyfully, "The baby is born! The baby is born! It's a beautiful, healthy boy." Eileithyia, startled by the news, leaps up and, in her surprise, unclasps her limbs. And in that moment, the spell breaks. Alcmene's labour immediately resumes its natural course. The baby is born with a loud cry that seems to shake the walls of the house. The midwives gasp when they see him. He is larger than any newborn they have ever delivered. With a grip so strong he nearly breaks the finger of the woman who tries to swaddle him. His eyes, when they open, seem to possess an intelligence far beyond his mere moments of life. Alcmene names him Alcaeus, meaning strength of Alcmene, but history will know him by another name, Heracles, meaning glory of Hera. It's almost ironic, isn't it? The child who will spend his entire life trying to appease Hera's wrath bears a name that honors her. But Hera is not finished. Far from it. A few nights after the birth, when the household has finally returned to something resembling normal, she makes her next move. 2 enormous snakes slither through the darkness toward the nursery, where infant Heracles sleeps beside his twin brother, Iphicles. Yes, Alcmene had twins, but only one was the child of Zeus. Imagine yourself a watchman walking the quiet streets of Thebes that night. The moon is high, casting long shadows between the buildings. You hear nothing unusual, you see nothing strange. But inside that house, something extraordinary is happening. The snakes glide through the window, their scales barely whispering against the stone sill. These are massive creatures sent by Hera herself, with venom potent enough to kill a dozen grown men. Their eyes gleam in the moonlight as they approach the sleeping infants. Iphicles wakes first and begins to cry, a natural reaction for any ordinary child encountering such horror. His cries awaken the parents, who rush in, but by the time they reach the nursery, they find something that will be spoken of in Thebes for generations. There, infant Heracles babbles happily, holding an enormous snake in each tiny fist. He squeezes them like toys, and these great serpents, these instruments of divine vengeance, are dead. The baby, who should have been terrified, is laughing. The child, who should have been helpless, has instead demonstrated a strength that should not belong to someone barely a week old. Amphitryon gazes at this scene, and understanding begins to dawn. His wife's mysterious pregnancy, the difficult birth, and now, this display of impossible strength. This is no ordinary child. This is the son of a god. From that night on, everyone in the house knew they were raising someone special. Heracles grew with supernatural speed and strength. By the time he was a toddler, he could lift stones that grown men struggled with. At 5, he could outrun horses. But with that strength came a burden that would haunt him his entire life: Hera's unending hatred. You see, this is not just a story about a strong baby. It is the beginning of a much longer story about what happens when divine power clashes with mortal life. Heracles did not choose to be the son of Zeus. He did not ask for supernatural strength or Hera's eternal enmity. but from the moment of his birth, his path was predetermined. As young Heracles grows, his parents try to give him as normal a childhood as possible. They hire the best teachers, Linus for music, Castor for combat, and Chiron the centaur for hunting and healing. But even in these lessons, Heracles' nature manifests. When Linus tries to correct his lyre playing with a harsh word, Heracles accidentally kills him with the instrument in a moment of frustration. These accidents become a pattern. Heracles' strength, combined with his all-too-human emotions, creates constant problems. He doesn't want to hurt anyone, but when you are 10 times stronger than everyone around you, even the gentlest touch can cause damage. Meanwhile, on Mount Olympus, Hera watches and waits. She has realized that direct attacks will not work. The boy is too strong, too resilient. But patience is a divine virtue, and Hera has all the time in the world. She begins to sow the seeds of a much more sophisticated revenge, one that will use Heracles' own strength against him. And so our hero grows into a man, loved by his family, revered by his city, yet carrying within him the seeds of both greatness and tragedy. His birth was marked by wonders and monsters, and his life will be defined by the tension between his divine heritage and his human heart. But what happens when that human heart is pushed to its breaking point? What happens when divine manipulation meets a mortal breaking point? The answer to that question lies in the shadows already gathering over Heracles' seemingly bright future. The shadows we spoke of are about to fall upon Heracles' life in the cruelest way imaginable. You are about to witness how even the mightiest hero can be broken, not by external enemies, but by the divine manipulation of his own mind. Imagine Heracles now as a grown man in the prime of his strength. He is married to Megara, a princess of Thebes, and they have 3 beautiful children. Their home is filled with laughter and the ordinary sounds of family life. Children playing, Megara humming as she tends her garden, Heracles telling stories by the fire in the evenings. You could pass their house on any given day and see what appears to be perfect domestic bliss. Heracles, whose power was legendary, worked tirelessly for the good of his native Thebes. He ruthlessly dealt with bandits, tirelessly protected travelers from harm, and even provided invaluable assistance on large construction projects, which undoubtedly contributed to the city's prosperity. His children, full of untamed energy, would climb him with delighted squeals, like a living mountain, as he, with paternal tenderness, tossed them into the air. However, the goddess Hera watched all this with increasing irritation. It was unbearable for her to see Zeus's illegitimate son not only survive but thrive in life. He was gifted with love, enjoyed respect, and had a family. All things that, seemingly, should have brought him happiness. And this circumstance was absolutely unacceptable to Hera. She had already launched direct attacks, but all had proven unsuccessful. Now she decided to resort to a much more insidious plan. For, as is well known, the cruelest punishments often turn our greatest strengths into our worst flaws. Heracles' unparalleled strength had always been his defining characteristic. But what if that power spiraled out of control? What if the very strength that made him a hero became the instrument of his most terrible tragedy? Hera, filled with malice, sends Lyssa, the goddess of mad rage, to visit Heracles. This is not the madness that causes foaming at the mouth and delirium. This is something far more sophisticated and therefore more terrifying. This is a madness that creeps in subtly, distorting perception, twisting reality, until one can no longer distinguish friend from foe. The madness begins to manifest on a seemingly ordinary evening. Heracles returns home after a tiring day spent helping farmers move massive boulders from their fields. He is weary but satisfied, anticipating dinner with his family. However, as he approaches his home, he senses something is amiss. The familiar sounds seem different somehow. His children's laughter sounds menacing. Megara's voice, calling them to dinner, takes on a conspiratorial tone. Imagine a neighbor, perhaps tending their garden, as evening falls. They notice Heracles frozen at his front door, his head cocked, as if listening to something only he can hear. There is a tension in his shoulders that wasn't there this morning. His hands, usually so gentle with his family, are clenched into fists. Inside the house, Megara and the children are completely unaware of the impending doom. She prepares dinner, bread, still warm from the oven, olives from their own tree, cheese from the market. The children are engrossed in a game, accompanied by running and giggling. It is a scene that should warm any father's heart. But when Heracles finally enters the house, he does not see his family. Lyssa's influence has so completely warped his perception that he sees enemies everywhere. His beloved wife appears before him as a threat that must be eliminated. His precious children seem like the offspring of his foes, sent to destroy him. The tragedy unfolds with horrifying speed. Heracles, convinced he is defending himself against attackers, uses his immense strength to fight what he perceives as monsters and enemies. But there are no monsters. There are no enemies. There is only a loving family who trusted him completely and never anticipated the coming attack. When the madness finally recedes, Heracles finds himself standing in his own home, surrounded by destruction. The reality of what he has done crashes down upon him like a cold wave. His wife, his children, all dead by his own hand. The strength that was meant to protect them became the instrument of their annihilation. Imagine the moment when his vision clears completely. The late evening light streams through the window, illuminating a scene of such grief that even the gods themselves might weep. Heracles falls to his knees, his great strength useless against the weight of sorrow and horror. He cries out with such agony that people throughout Thebes cease their activities, struck by the sound of a shattering soul. Neighbors rush in but stop at the threshold, seeing what has transpired. Here is the great hero of Thebes, the man who could wrestle lions and move mountains, reduced to sobbing over the bodies of his own family. Some whisper that this must be divine punishment. Others simply stand in shocked silence. News quickly spreads through the city. By morning, everyone knows what happened. But the question that troubles everyone is the same that torments Heracles. How could someone so fundamentally good commit something so unspeakably evil? The answer, of course, lies with Hera and her cruel manipulation. But knowing this does not make the grief less real, nor the guilt easier to bear. Heracles may have been an unwitting instrument of tragedy, but the blood on his hands is still real. The love he lost is still gone forever. For several days, Heracles refuses to eat, drink, or speak to anyone. He sits in his ruined home like a statue, staring into nothingness. Friends try to approach him, but his grief is so profound that words feel inadequate. What can one say to someone whose greatest strength has become his greatest curse? Finally, his nephew, Iolaus, manages to reach him. Iolaus is young, barely more than a boy, but he has always worshipped his uncle. He sits beside Heracles and does not try to offer comfort or explanations. He simply sits there, sharing the silence. After a long time, Heracles finally speaks, his voice barely audible. I killed them. I killed my own family. How can I live with this? Iolaus, wise beyond his years, does not try to diminish what happened or offer easy absolution. Instead, he says something that will change the course of Heracles' life. Uncle, you cannot bring them back, but perhaps you can make their deaths mean something. Perhaps you can find a way to serve others so fully that their memory becomes a blessing, not a curse. This conversation planted the seed of an idea that would eventually lead Heracles to the Oracle of Delphi. But first he had to find a way to live with what he had done. He began to wander, leaving Thebes behind, unable to bear the sight of the home where his family had died. For months he roamed the Greek countryside like a ghost. He helped where he could, clearing roads of bandits, rescuing travelers from wild animals. But he found no joy in these acts of heroism. It was penance, not celebration. He was trying to balance some cosmic scales, though he knew nothing could truly balance the loss of innocent lives. During this time of wandering, Heracles developed a philosophy that would guide him in the trials to come. He learned that strength without wisdom is dangerous, that power without humility is destructive. He began to understand that true heroism is not about being the strongest or the bravest. It is about serving others, especially when serving others costs you everything. Grief changed him fundamentally. The easy confidence of youth was gone, replaced by a deeper understanding of human fragility. He learned that anyone, no matter how strong or well-intentioned, could fall victim to forces beyond their control. This knowledge made him more compassionate toward the failures of others, and more determined to use the rest of his life to serve those who needed protection. But the question remained, what form should this service take? How to atone for the unforgivable? The answer would come from the most unexpected source, from the very cousin who had always envied his strength, and would use that strength to humiliate him in ways that would make even the gods uneasy. Sometimes the path to redemption leads through the valley of humiliation, and sometimes that is exactly where a broken hero needs to go to become whole again. The path to redemption led Heracles to Delphi, where the oracle speaks in riddles and smoke. Her words still echoed in his mind as he walked the dusty road to Tyrants. Serve Eurystheus for 12 years. Perform any tasks he gives you. Only then will you be purified of your guilt. One might wonder how someone as powerful as Heracles came to be bound in service to his cowardly cousin, Eurystheus. But this was precisely what Hera intended. She had arranged for Eurystheus to be born moments before Heracles, making him the rightful king of Tyrants, and giving him the legal right to command the son of Zeus. It was a masterpiece of divine manipulation, using Heracles' own sense of honor to trap him in servitude. Imagine the scene as Heracles first arrives at the palace in Tyrants. Eurystheus has built himself a bronze chamber underground, a bunker where he can hide whenever his dangerous cousin comes to visit. The irony is palpable. The king is so afraid of his own subject that he literally needs to go underground to feel safe. But today, for the first labor, Eurystheus forces himself to appear in person. He sits on his throne trying to look regal, while his hands tremble slightly. Heracles kneels before him, and you can see the struggle on the hero's face. Every instinct tells him to refuse this humiliation, but his vow to the oracle holds him fast. "Your first task," Eurystheus announces, his voice quivering slightly, "is to kill the Nemean lion and bring me its hide as proof." Now, you might think that sounds simple enough. Heracles had killed dangerous animals before, but the Nemean lion was no mere beast. This creature was the offspring of monsters. Its mother, Echidna, was half woman, half snake, and its father, Typhon, was a giant with 100 dragon heads. The lion itself was massive, with golden fur that gleamed like armor and claws that could shred the strongest shields. Most importantly, the Nemean lion's hide could not be pierced by any mortal weapon. Swords bent against it, spears shattered, arrows bounced harmlessly. For 30 years, this creature had terrorized the hills around Nemea, killing livestock, travelers, and anyone foolish enough to hunt it. Entire villages had been abandoned because of its presence. Heracles accepted the task assigned to him without a word of protest, and although glimmers of deep contemplation could be seen in his eyes, he was steadily mastering the art of strategic thinking, learning to meticulously plan his actions rather than relying solely on brute force. This newfound acumen, forged in the crucible of recent tragedy, would undoubtedly prove invaluable in the series of trials to come. The journey to Nemea took the hero several agonizing days, and Heracles wisely used this time to focus on gathering comprehensive intelligence. He lingered in roadside taverns and at secluded farms, conversing with anyone who had had the misfortune of encountering the terrible lion or witnessed its bloody deeds. The information he received was deeply disturbing. It became clear that the beast possessed not only colossal physical power, but also sophisticated intelligence. Its hunting was purely strategic. It skillfully set ambushes, carefully analyzing and learning from. Its encounters with previous hunters. One evening, as he made camp by a babbling brook, Heracles met an elderly shepherd who had lost his entire flock to the lion. "It's completely unnatural," the old man muttered, thoughtfully poking the embers of his fire. "Animals don't usually play with their prey, but this one seemed to revel in the act of killing, leaving half the sheep uneaten, just scattered, as if it aimed to prove something." This conversation finally solidified Heracles' suspicions. The Nemean lion was not just a wild beast. It was a genuine monster, an embodiment of pure, senseless destruction. To kill it meant not merely overcoming a physical danger. It would require not only physically overcoming it, but outwitting its sophisticated and malevolent mind. When Heracles finally reached the area around Nemea, the undeniable signs of the lion's presence were everywhere. Trees were deeply scarred by claw marks 2.5 meters off the ground. The few surviving farms were fortified like impregnable military camps. It seemed as if the very air was imbued with a sense of unseen threat, as if the land itself held the memory of the terror that haunted it. Heracles set up his camp in a shady grove of olive trees, from which he had an excellent view in all directions. He dedicated the first night solely to observation, employing all his sharpened senses to map the territory under the lion's sway. Around midnight, he heard that sound, a roar that shook the earth to its very depths and sent all other wild creatures fleeing in silent terror. It was a sound that bespoke absolute dominance, of a predator so unshakably confident in its immense power that it utterly disregarded any stealth. The next morning, Heracles seriously began tracking. He followed the lion's paw prints through rugged, rocky valleys and dense thickets, carefully studying the creature's movements. The tracks left behind indicated its colossal size and astonishing grace. This hunter was capable of moving absolutely silently when it needed to, despite weighing as much as a small horse. For 3 days they circled each other in a deadly dance. Heracles only occasionally glimpsed a flash of golden fur gliding through the dense undergrowth. The lion itself seemed to be studying him with no less intensity than the hero studied it. In these rare encounters, there was an intelligence that sent shivers down Heracles' spine. This was not just a predator stalking its prey, but a monster assessing a potential threat. On the 4th day, Heracles decided to test his assumptions about the lion's invulnerability. He took a position on a high mountain ridge, which offered an ideal shot, and released his best arrow, guided by all his unparalleled skill and supernatural strength. The arrow struck the lion directly in the shoulder, but harmlessly bounced off its golden hide. The beast did not even flinch. Instead, it slowly turned to look directly at Heracles, baring its fangs in a grimace that could only be interpreted as a sinister smile. That moonless night, sitting alone by his flickering campfire, Heracles intensely pondered the seemingly insoluble problem. His sword could not pierce that impenetrable hide. His arrows proved powerless to penetrate it. Even his massive club, carved from an ancient olive tree and as hard as tempered iron, seemed utterly ineffective against such supernatural protection. How could one defeat a creature that could not be destroyed by ordinary weapons? The answer came to him gradually, like an epiphany, crystallized from careful observation and relentless logic. If the beast's hide could not be pierced from the outside, then what if the impact came from within? If traditional weapons were useless, what about the only weapon he always carried? His own mighty hands. The plan he devised was incredibly daring and mortally dangerous. He would have to get close enough to the lion to engage in hand-to-hand combat, close enough for the beast's terrifying claws and fangs to easily reach him. But it was the only approach with any chance of success. He would have to strangle the monster, turning its own strength against itself. The decisive battle unfolded in a narrow, deep valley with sheer cliffs, a natural arena where neither combatant had a path to retreat. Heracles entered the valley at dawn, making no attempt to hide. He wanted the lion to know who was coming. He sought a fair fight, a battle of predator against predator. The Nemean lion emerged from its lair like a mass of liquid gold that had taken on a deadly form. It was even larger than Heracles could have imagined, with a mane that seemed to radiate its own glow. For one brief moment they simply stared at each other, the monster that had terrorized the entire region for decades, and the hero who had come to end its bloody reign. Then the lion launched a swift attack, moving with shocking speed for such a large creature. Heracles did not try to dodge or use a weapon. Instead, he met the attack head-on, wrapping his mighty arms around the beast's neck at the very moment its claws plunged into the hero's chest. The pain was instantaneous and unbearable, but Heracles held on with unyielding fortitude. What followed was less a battle than an exhausting contest of pure will and incredible endurance. The lion thrashed and roared furiously, trying to shake off this impossible, unyielding prey. Its sharp claws tore at Heracles' back and sides, and its colossal weight threatened to crush him. Heracles, nevertheless, maintained his iron grip, slowly but steadily tightening his hands around the creature's mighty throat. The minutes dragged on agonizingly. The lion's struggle grew more desperate, then gradually faded. Heracles felt his own strength drain from immense blood loss and complete exhaustion, but he did not loosen his grip. This is what he had learned from the tragedy he endured. Sometimes victory requires sacrificing absolutely everything, including even the certainty of one's own survival. Finally, the great beast shuddered in a last convulsion and went still. The terror of Nemea was dead. It was killed not by sword or spear, but by the simple, monstrous strength of human resolve. Heracles loosened his grip and collapsed backward, gasping and bleeding, but still alive. However, the task was not yet fully completed. Eurystheus demanded not only the beast's death, but also its hide as irrefutable proof of the deed. And obtaining this hide proved to be a task almost as difficult as the killing itself. It must be remembered that nothing could pierce that unique golden fur, even after its owner's death. Heracles tried every blade he possessed, but all proved useless, not even leaving the slightest scratch on the tough hide. And then a sudden inspiration struck him. If no external object could cut the hide, what if he used the lion's own claws? Using one of the razor-sharp claws of the fallen creature, Heracles carefully began to skin the beast. It was slow, arduous, and painstaking work, but eventually he held in his hands a whole, gleaming golden hide, destined to become his distinctive and legendary garment. When Heracles returned to Tiryns clad in the lion's hide like a magnificent cloak, the effect on King Eurystheus was immediate and profound. The king cast but one terrified glance at his cousin, still blood-stained, wearing the hide of the unkillable monster and carrying the massive head of the beast like a helmet, and in a panic, fled to his underground chamber. From then on, Eurystheus preferred to communicate with Heracles solely through a herald, being too afraid to meet the hero face to face. And perhaps there was wisdom in this, for something had irreversibly changed in Heracles during this first labor. He realized that even the most impossible could be overcome with the right combination of indomitable courage, sharp intellect, and a pure, stubborn refusal to give up. But standing in the empty throne room, listening to Eurystheus's muffled voice coming from his bronze chamber deep underground, Heracles knew this was only the very beginning of his journey. 11 more labors awaited him, and Hera's sinister influence seemed only to intensify with each of his successes. The questions that would haunt him throughout all subsequent trials had already begun to form in his mind. What happens when courage alone is not enough? What trial is capable of breaking even one who strangled an unkillable lion? The golden hide of the vanquished lion gleamed in the morning sun as Heracles made his way to Eurystheus's bronze chamber. News of his first triumph had already spread throughout Greece, and crowds lined the roads to catch even a glimpse of the hero who had accomplished the seemingly impossible. But Heracles barely noticed their adoring attention. His mind was already fully consumed by the next trial he was to face. From the impenetrable safety of his underground bunker, Eurystheus's voice echoed dully through a speaking tube, an ingenious invention that allowed him to issue commands without confronting the terrifying sight of his highly successful cousin face to face. "Your second labor," the king proclaimed, his words sounding distorted and muffled by the bronze walls, "is to destroy the Lernaean Hydra, and this time you will go forth entirely alone." This last detail was crucial, Seeing how Heracles had overcome the Nemean lion, Hera, filled with malice, had whispered insidious suggestions to Eurystheus. No helpers, no companions. The hero was to face this monster in complete isolation, relying solely on his own strength and cunning. But Heracles had already gleaned something valuable from his nephew regarding the true nature of heroism and unwavering loyalty. As he prepared to depart Tiryns, he found the young man awaiting him by the chariot, armed and fully ready for the journey. The king bade you face the Hydra alone, Iolaus said with a faint but confident smile, but he said nothing about not having a charioteer for the journey. Imagine these two as they, guided by fate, make their way to Lerna. The invincible Heracles, clad in the legendary lion's hide, and his loyal nephew, the ardent Iolaus, who followed him with indomitable determination, unwilling to remain in the shadows. Their bond had become unbreakable since that grim night when Iolaus first managed to break through the veil of profound grief that enveloped Heracles. Now, they were bound by something more than just blood ties. A light but deep companionship, a true friendship whose strength needed no constant verbal affirmations or ostentatious gestures. The landscape changed relentlessly as they approached the foul swamps of Lerna. The air grew heavy and saturated with moisture, carrying the suffocating stench of stagnant waters and decaying organic matter. The trees along the path appeared grotesquely twisted and ulcerated, as if afflicted by an incurable disease. Even the sunlight here barely pierced through the dense veil of eternal mist, constantly rising from the ominous bogs. The few locals who dared to linger in these cursed lands recounted such gruesome tales that even the steadfast Heracles felt a chill of unease. The Lernaean Hydra was not just a monster, it was a genuine curse that had afflicted these lands. Its breath was so deadly that it incinerated vegetation for leagues around, and its very presence poisoned every drop of water and every patch of soil. But the most terrifying was the knowledge of the creature's 9 heads, each possessing its own independent mind. My grandfather saw it once, a trembling old farmer whose hands betrayed deeply ingrained fear told them. He said it was like a nightmare come alive. The heads would argue with each other about which way to chase prey, but when they agreed on something, the gods helped whatever they hunted. As they advanced further towards the Hydra's lair, the signs of its pervasive influence became undeniable and all-encompassing. In the streams that once teemed with life, now lifeless fish floated, their pale bellies turned skyward. Birds, carelessly flying too close to the infested bogs, suddenly plummeted from the heavens, struck down by an invisible force. Even insects had acquired a grotesque, unnatural appearance, too large, excessively aggressive, distorted by the monster's poisonous influence. Heracles and Iolaus wisely set up their camp on a raised hill overlooking the swamp, but at the maximum permissible distance to avoid the lethal effects of the creature's toxic breath. From this strategically advantageous point, they could clearly see the Hydra's lair, a massive, ominous spring from whose depths, from beneath the earth, streams of black water erupted. The banks surrounding the spring were littered with bleached, silent bones of countless victims, both wild beasts and unfortunate humans. That evening, as they strategized for the impending battle, Heracles shared his disturbing observations with Iolaus. "We have more to worry about than just the poison," he said, his gaze piercing the gathering gloom, scanning the ominous lair. "Look at the arrangement of these bones. The Hydra doesn't just kill its victims. It seems to revel in playing with them before devouring. Indeed, the chaotic yet purposeful arrangement of the remains suggested the creature possessed a sophisticated, cruel intelligence. Some skeletons were positioned as if their owners had tried to crawl away in agony at the moment of death. Others were neatly stacked in gruesome piles like sinister. Trophies. This was not mindless slaughter by a primitive beast. This was the deliberate act of a creature that undoubtedly derived perverse pleasure from sowing terror and suffering. With the first rays of dawn the next day, the time came for their first direct confrontation with the monster. Heracles, true to his word, moved towards the spring alone, while Iolaus remained at a distance, holding the chariot and the restless horses. Their plan seemed straightforward: lure the Hydra from its lair, engage it in battle, and trust that the legendary Nemean lion's hide would provide sufficient protection against its deadly venom. But they had not accounted for one thing: the Hydra's monstrous patience. For long hours Heracles stood at the edge of the foul swamp, shouting challenges, throwing stones into the dark waters, and even firing flaming arrows. Yet nothing happened. The spring remained silent and grim, showing no hint of life in its depths. Only when Heracles, frustrated by the apparent lack of reaction, turned to leave the spot, did the Hydra finally strike. The water's surface suddenly exploded, and a massive body began to rise from the spring. First one head appeared, then another, and another, until 9 serpentine necks writhed above the surface, like an ominous forest of living, twisting branches. The creature's body, when it fully emerged from the water, proved even more hideous and terrifying than the most dreadful legends could have suggested. Resembling a gigantic elephant, it was covered in dark, wet scales glinting ominously in the dim light. Each of the heads was unique in appearance. Some had sharp horns, others fringed crests on their necks, still others several rows of sharp fangs, but all possessed the same blazing red eyes and the same expression of conscious, malevolent hatred. The attack descended upon Heracles from all sides simultaneously, without warning. 9 heads, each with its own malicious intent, struck independently, aiming to trap Heracles in a deadly snare, while the others provided cover and support. It was like fighting 9 separate but coordinated snakes at once, each seemingly learning instantly from the mistakes and successes of its brethren. Heracles' first impulse was to wield his famous club, and initially this approach seemed to bear fruit. One powerful, crushing blow smashed one of the monster's smaller heads, causing the creature to recoil, emitting a piercing shriek of pain from its remaining 8 mouths. But then, to Heracles' growing horror, something truly impossible occurred. In place of the destroyed head, 2 new vibrant ones began to grow rapidly. This was the Hydra's most nightmarish and insidious ability, which no brute force or direct assault could overcome. Each severed head immediately regenerated into 2, making the creature only stronger, not weakening it. With mounting despair, Heracles realized that his usual tactics, crushing force applied with unwavering resolve, would only worsen the situation, making his opponent even more powerful and invincible. The battle turned into a true nightmare, where every moment demanded incredible agility and constant evasion, as new malevolent heads sprouted from each previous wound. What began as a fight against 9 adversaries quickly became a struggle with 11, then 13, and then 15 heads. The Hydra's poisonous breath grew increasingly concentrated and lethal as its numbers increased, forcing Heracles to fight while holding his breath and keeping his eyes half closed to protect himself from the acrid, toxic fumes. But at this critical moment one must not forget Iolaus, who, observing the events from what seemed a safe distance, grasped the true nature of the battle. The young man, whose heart was filled with anxiety for his uncle, clearly understood that conventional tactics were completely inapplicable here. This was not merely a battle, but a complex riddle disguised as a fight, and it had to be solved, not simply fought. Ancient stories and childhood tales of regenerating monsters, tales in which fire always served as the sole key to ultimate victory over such creatures, resurfaced in his memory. Driven by sudden insight and desperate courage, Iolaus decisively steered the chariot directly into the thick of the deadly struggle. He leaped from it, holding a flaming torch, reaching the Hydra at the very moment Heracles severed another head. Without allowing the wound even to begin to close, Iolaus pressed the torch to the bleeding stump of the neck, cauterizing it with scorching, purifying flame. The effect was instantaneous and absolutely decisive. The seared wound did not regenerate. Instead, it sealed permanently, depriving the Hydra of one head without the slightest possibility of its restoration. Heracles, instantly realizing the genius of this solution, gave his nephew a smile that conveyed pure, unadulterated admiration. Then followed a mesmerizing dance of perfect coordination and mutual understanding between the great hero and his valiant helper. Heracles struck with astonishing, almost surgical precision, severing the monsters' heads one after another, while Iolaus, like a shadow, followed him with his flaming torch, tirelessly sealing each wound, giving regeneration no chance to begin. Such work required not only instantaneous reaction, but also absolute, unquestioning trust in each other. A single moment of hesitation, and the Hydra's heads could have spiraled out of control, dooming them to certain death. The monster finally realized its fate, and its actions became increasingly desperate and chaotic. The remaining heads, as if driven mad, struck with new wild fury, attempting to destroy both heroes before they could complete their systematic extermination. Deadly poison sprayed in all directions, turning the air into suffocating venom. The creature's massive body thrashed in convulsions, trying to crush them with its monstrous weight. However, Heracles and Iolaus had already found their deadly rhythm. Head after head fell under the crushing blows of the club, and each wound was immediately sealed by the purifying flame. From 9 they were left with 8, then 7, then 6. With each new success of the heroes, the monster's coordination catastrophically deteriorated. Panic gripped the remaining heads. They began to thrash erratically, losing all semblance of working. Together, when only one last head remained, the Hydra made a final, desperate attempt to escape. It began to retreat towards the spring, hoping to find refuge in the safety of the deep, dark waters where the heroes, it believed, would not be able to follow. But Heracles was not about to let it slip away. With a single leap he jumped onto the monster's back, riding it like a wild horse, preparing to deliver the final, decisive blow with his mighty club. The last head separated from the body with a repulsive, wet thud, and Iolaus's torch, pressed to the wound, forever ended the reign of terror of the Lernaean Hydra. The monster's enormous body shuddered once, then lay still, lifeless. The poisonous mist that had hung over the cursed swamps for decades slowly began to dissipate, and for the first time in generations, pure, life-giving sunlight touched the waters of Lerna. However, for Heracles, the work was not yet entirely complete. He always approached his labours with utmost thoroughness and foresight. He dipped his arrows into the Hydra's poisonous blood, thus creating weapons that would forever carry the monster's deadly venom. These arrows, imbued with the lethal essence, would serve him greatly in trials to come, though, ironically, they would also bring unexpected and profound tragedy to one he cherished and loved immensely. Heracles also extracted the Hydra's central fang, a curved, blade-like object, sharper and harder than any steel, capable of piercing anything, even, as he would later discover, the impenetrable hide of the Nemean lion. These trophies were not merely symbols of victory achieved. They represented invaluable tools that would prove indispensable in the numerous trials awaiting him. However, when the heroes returned to Tyrants, a cruel and unexpected surprise awaited them. King Eurystheus, long harbouring animosity towards Heracles, was already expecting them. From his bronze chamber, as if from a dungeon, he haughtily proclaimed, "This labour will not be counted. Your victory is unclean, for you had a helper. Iolaus assisted you with the torch, and the task was to fight the Hydra alone." This was a bitter, humiliating moment for Heracles, compounded by the realization that Eurystheus was, in essence, technically correct. But Iolaus, whose nobility and wisdom grew with each trial, stepped forward and spoke with calm dignity. "Uncle," he began, addressing not only Heracles but the king himself, "we have learned something far more important here in these cursed swamps than simply defeating a monster. Some monsters, it turns out, cannot be overcome by brute force alone. They require friendship, true cooperation, and an unwavering willingness to trust each other. And if that deprives us of this formal victory, then perhaps the real victory lies not in satisfying the whims of kings, but in discovering what truly makes us strong. The true wisdom gained from the encounter with the Lernaean Hydra, perhaps, lay in the realization that some of life's greatest difficulties do not yield to direct assault, but are only exacerbated by such an approach. However, by joining forces, when individuals merge their unique strengths and compensate for mutual weaknesses, even the most formidable and seemingly insurmountable monsters can be vanquished. As Heracles faces his next trial, a pressing question arises. Will he be able to remember this fundamental lesson when future labours demand of him not only physical might, but also profound wisdom, inexhaustible patience, and the astonishing courage to be gentle? The relationship between Heracles and King Eurystheus underwent a noticeable change. After the heated debate that erupted over the Hydra labour, a new, more sophisticated calculation became evident in the monarch's approach to formulating tasks. Eurystheus realized that crude physical strength alone would not be enough to fully humiliate his mighty cousin. A more subtle, almost psychological form of trial was probably required, one capable of inflicting suffering in a different way. "Your third labour," Eurystheus proclaimed, addressing the hero through his speaking tube, and a note of peculiar, malicious satisfaction was clearly audible in his voice, "is to capture the Ceryneian hind alive and deliver it to me completely unharmed. You have exactly 1 year to accomplish this task." At first glance, this assignment might have seemed a welcome respite. After the exhausting battles with venom-spewing, regenerating monsters, what could be so difficult about catching an ordinary deer? However, as Heracles carefully listened to the full description of his new objective, he gradually began to grasp the cruel cunning and sophisticated trickery of this commission. The Ceryneian hind was no mere wild deer. It was a creature of exceptional, unearthly beauty, distinguished by golden antlers that shone like captured sunlight and bronze hooves that emitted a melodic ringing sound, like bells with every stride. Most importantly, this animal was sacred to Artemis, the powerful goddess of the hunt, and was under her personal divine protection. Any attempt to kill or harm it would inevitably incur the wrath of Artemis herself upon the hero. But the truly diabolical, agonizing part of this trial lay elsewhere. The hind possessed incredible speed, surpassing anything mortal creatures could ever imagine. It was capable of outrunning the very wind, covering hundreds of miles in a single day without the slightest sign of fatigue. For an entire year, Heracles was to relentlessly pursue this seemingly elusive creature, under no circumstances harming it, all while knowing that his failure would mean not only personal humiliation and shame, but also inevitable divine retribution. Imagine Heracles preparing for this labor, which was radically different from all the previous battles he had fought. Instead of his usual weapons and heavy armor, the hero took only hunting nets, strong ropes, and necessary provisions, anticipating an extremely long and arduous journey. Iolaus, his faithful companion, offered to join him, but Heracles merely shook his head. "This is something I must accomplish alone," he said, "and not because Eurystheus demands it, but because I need to learn something important about myself." The hunt began amidst the rolling landscapes around Cerynea, an area where the hind was most often sighted. Local shepherds whispered about it, describing fleeting flashes of golden radiance darting through the forest thickets faster than human thought. "She is like a piece of the sun broken loose that has learned to run," an elderly woman told Heracles. "Beautiful beyond description, yet utterly elusive." For the first few months, Heracles diligently pursued the hind, employing traditional hunting methods. He easily tracked its hoofprints, as the bronze hooves left very distinctive marks on the soft soil. The hero carefully studied its favorite trails, its watering holes by springs, and the fertile meadows where it usually grazed. However, each time he approached close enough to glimpse it, the hind instantly vanished, like a fleeting golden dream. It seemed the sacred animal was aware of its pursuit, but did not flee in panicked terror, as ordinary beasts would. On the contrary, there was an almost playful, teasing quality to their chase. It might graze peacefully in a meadow until Heracles approached close enough to attempt capture, and then would leap away with such incredible grace that its movements seemed artfully choreographed. At times it even paused to look back at its pursuer, as if checking if he was still following. Summer gradually gave way to autumn, and then autumn was replaced by winter. Heracles, in turn, learned to read the changing seasons by observing the elusive hind's behavior. In the summer months, it preferred high mountain pastures. With the arrival of autumn, it moved to oak groves, where fallen acorns provided it with easy and abundant food. Winter found it in the lower valleys, where streams, fed by underground springs, flowed warm. However, no matter how carefully Heracles studied its habits, he could not overcome that last, crucial gap. The hind always remained one step ahead, one elusive leap beyond reach. For a man accustomed to solving all problems with brute force and unwavering determination, this constant yet unachieved success transformed into a refined, almost tender form of torture. It was during the long winter nights, when the hero remained utterly alone beneath the impossibly distant, shimmering stars, that Heracles began to grasp the true meaning and lessons held within this trial. He learned patience, not the kind he was accustomed to, gritting his teeth in tension, but a deeper, calmer and more serene acceptance of things that could not be rushed or forced. He began to pay attention to the minutiae of the surrounding world that he had never noticed before, how the morning mist rose from the streams, the unique quality of light filtering through the canopies of different trees, and the changing songs of birds with the passing seasons. For the first time since the tragic death of his family, Heracles began to find inner peace in simply being and observing, rather than in the continuous striving to achieve some goal. Spring arrived, and with it, subtle but significant changes occurred in the dynamic between the hunter and his elusive quarry. The hind still skillfully evaded capture, yet now there were moments when it did not rush to flee at Heracles' approach. It might continue to graze calmly while he sat perfectly still 50 yards away, making no attempt to approach or retreat. These peaceful interludes, filled with quiet understanding, became increasingly frequent as the months passed. One morning in late spring, as Heracles sat quietly by a crystal-clear stream, enjoying his modest breakfast of bread and olives, the hind appeared on the opposite bank. It was close enough for the hero to discern individual golden hairs in its fur, and see a warm, almost intelligent spark in its dark eyes. For a long moment they simply looked at each other across the gently flowing water. Then something truly astonishing happened. The hind gracefully stepped into the stream and began to slowly cross it. Towards him. Every instinct screamed at Heracles to grab a net, to make a decisive move immediately, but some inner intuition told him that any hasty gesture would ruin everything. Instead, he continued to calmly eat his breakfast, as if nothing unusual were happening. Emerging from the stream, the hind slowly, with utmost caution, but completely without fear, approached the hero. It came so close that Heracles could have reached out and touched its golden flank. However, instead, he broke off a piece of his bread and offered it to her on an open palm. The animal cautiously sniffed the treat, then accepted it with surprising, almost human gentleness. Its lips were soft on his skin, like the touch of silk. For several minutes they shared their morning meal in comfortable, peaceful silence. The hero and the sacred deer, predator and prey, they had forged an unexpected friendship during a pursuit that had defined their lives for almost an entire year. It was in this moment of perfect, profound peace that Heracles finally understood the true nature of his seemingly impossible task. He was not meant to capture the hind with brute force or clever traps. His goal was to earn its trust so fully and sincerely that it would, of its own volition, wish to follow him. Thus, this labor turned out to be not an act of conquest or dominance, but, in essence, a test of building true, trusting relationships. Over the following days, this amazing scenario repeated itself again and again. The hind visited him during his stops, calmly ate directly from his hands, and even allowed him to gently stroke its neck. However, it invariably maintained its independence, never coming close enough for him to restrain it against its will. Finally, with only 1 week remaining before his year-long deadline expired, Heracles made a decision that surprised even himself. He approached the hind not with ropes or nets in hand, but with words. "Lady," he said. Formally, fully acknowledging her sacred nature, "I require your assistance, not as a hunter who has caught his prey, but as one who requests a favor from a friend." He sincerely and thoroughly explained his difficult situation, the series of labors, his deep guilt over his family's death, and the pressing need for atonement. The hind listened with what seemed to be genuine attention, tilting its head in an almost human gesture of contemplation. When Heracles finished speaking, the hind approached him and, to his profound astonishment, calmly lay down at his feet. It voluntarily offered itself, fully trusting him to keep his promise, and that no harm would come to it. It was a moment of such pure, ethereal grace that tears welled in Heracles' eyes. The journey back to Tyrants became a truly unique experience for Heracles, unlike anything he had ever encountered before. The hind walked beside him like a devoted companion. At times it would run ahead to scout the path. At others it would fall behind, captivated by exploring interesting scents. It could have fled at any moment, but each time it chose to remain by his side. This conscious choice completely transformed the entire essence and nature of the accomplished labor. When they finally reached the palace, Eurystheus emerged from his underground chamber for the first time since Heracles had begun his labors. The sight of the golden hind, walking completely freely beside the hero, was so unexpected and astonishing that even the cowardly king could not resist his curiosity and came out to see it with his own eyes. "How did you catch it?" Eurystheus asked, clearly anticipating a tale of cunning traps or overwhelming force. "I did not catch her," Heracles replied simply and calmly. "I asked her to come with me, and she agreed." Sometimes what seems impossible becomes quite achievable when we stop trying to force things and begin to seek to understand them. As if to confirm these words, the hind approached and touched Eurystheus's hand with its nose, a gesture of greeting rather than submission. The king, despite his many vices and shortcomings, had to admit that he was in the presence of something truly sacred and miraculous. However, the labor had to be completed in strict accordance with its original conditions, and those conditions required the hind to be placed under Eurystheus's complete control. This was a moment that tested everything Heracles had learned and understood about trust and empathy. How could he now simultaneously observe the letter of his obligation and the spirit of the deep friendship he had managed to forge with this remarkable creature? Asterisk, asterisk. A quiet agreement and looming threat. Asterisk, asterisk. The solution seemed to come from the hind itself, as if it understood the complexity of the dilemma. As a sign of understanding, it allowed the mighty Heracles to place a golden collar around its graceful neck, not as a symbol of subjugation, but as an unshakable confirmation of their unspoken agreement. Then, with astonishing calmness, the animal proceeded into the royal stables, where it settled comfortably in a stall abundantly supplied with fresh hay and crystal-clear water. For 3 days, exactly as required to fulfill the technical conditions of the labor, the hind remained there. At dawn on the 4th day, it simply vanished. The stall was empty, the collar gone without a trace, leaving behind nothing but a single golden hair found on Heracles' pillow. This hair became a silent sign of friendship, an eternal reminder of the wise lessons the hero had learned during the year spent in pursuit and interaction with this amazing creature. Standing in the empty stall, Heracles pondered deeply what he had gained from this most unusual of his labors. He realized that some victories are achieved only through patience, that true relationships are built on trust, not rigid control, and that sometimes the most powerful action is simply waiting until someone wishes to be present of their own accord. However, while savoring these new insights, he involuntarily wondered about the trials to come. If Eurystheus's cruelty was becoming more sophisticated, what impossible task now awaited him, capable of testing not only Heracles' physical might, but the very foundations of his evolving personality? Asterisk, asterisk. The looming threat. Asterisk, asterisk. Greece had plunged into the embrace of a harsh winter, and the peaceful memory of the Golden Hind now seemed an echo of a warmer, gentler time. As Heracles approached Eurystheus's palace, his breath plumed in the frosty air, and the snow crunched underfoot with each step. This time, when the king's voice echoed from his bronze chamber, it carried a note of disappointment, previously unheard. The matter with the hind had clearly not gone according to Eurystheus's plan. The king had harbored hopes of seeing Heracles agonizingly struggle with an impossible task, not form a friendship with his quarry. Now he was determined to present a trial that would play on what he considered his cousin's greatest weakness, his innate propensity for violence. "Your fourth labor," Eurystheus solemnly announced, "is to capture the Erymanthian boar alive and deliver it to me. This monster has terrorized the slopes of Mount Erymanthus for years, killing anyone who dares to trespass on its territory. You must bring it back alive, unharmed, and fully under control." At first glance, this might have seemed similar to the hind task, another mission focused on capture rather than killing. However, there was a crucial difference. The Ceryneian hind was an embodiment of grace and reason, capable of willing cooperation. The Erymanthian boar, on the other hand, was pure, untamed rage, having taken tangible form. It was a monster so consumed by its malice that it indiscriminately attacked everything that moved, including even its own reflection in calm waters. Try to imagine this creature, if you can. A wild boar the size of a small building, with tusks curved like deadly swords and eyes burning with unquenchable anger. Its hide, thick as armor, was scarred from countless battles with hunters who had fruitlessly tried to claim it as a trophy. Most unsettling was that it seemed to take genuine pleasure in destruction, veering off course to trample crops and demolish anything made by human hands. Heracles' strategy. Asterisk, asterisk. But Heracles had learned an important lesson from his recent labors. Brute force alone is not always the answer, and sometimes the most direct approach proves to be the least effective. As he prepared for his journey to Mount Erymanthus, he took with him not only traditional weapons but also ropes, nets, and various tools designed for capture, not for killing. The journey led him through some of the most picturesque winter landscapes in all of Greece. Snow-capped mountains rose like sleeping giants against a sky so piercingly blue it seemed painted. Pines wore white caps of snow, and streams flowed black and swift between banks of pristine snow. This place would have been ideal for contemplation and tranquility, were it not for the increasingly evident signs of the boar's presence. As Heracles ascended higher into the mountains, the evidence of the creature's fury became undeniable. Entire groves of trees had been felled, their trunks snapped like fragile branches. Boulders the size of houses had been moved from their millennia-old resting places. It seemed even the landscape itself bore the scars of the boar's destructive rage. But the true horror of this creature only became apparent when Heracles stumbled upon his first human victim. A hunter's camp, abandoned in obvious haste, told a story of terror and despair. Equipment lay in disarray, as if dropped during a panicked flight. The campfire had burned down to cold embers, and tracks in the snow indicated where someone had fled in terror to the lower valleys. Asterisk, asterisk. Encounter with survivors. Asterisk, asterisk. Heracles followed these tracks and eventually discovered a hunter, a middle-aged man named Pholus, who had taken refuge in a cave with several other survivors. They greeted Heracles with the desperate gratitude of people who had lived in fear for weeks. "It's not just an animal," Pholus explained as they sat by a small fire that night. "Animals kill for food, territory, or self-defense. This creature kills for the sheer joy of it. I've seen it chase deer for miles, not to eat them, but just for the thrill of the hunt. And when it catches them—" He shuddered, leaving the sentence unfinished. From these survivors, Heracles learned important details about the boar's behavior. It was most active during storms, as if the chaos of wind and snow fueled its rage. It had no permanent lair. It preferred to constantly roam the mountainside. Most importantly, it seemed to grow larger and more aggressive with each passing month, as if its own fury nourished its growth. Armed with this valuable information, Heracles began his hunt, patiently waiting for the right weather conditions. When a fierce blizzard descended upon the mountain, he took up position in a narrow valley that the boar frequently used as a travel route. His plan relied on observation and patience rather than direct confrontation, skills he had only recently begun to develop. Asterisk, asterisk, the hunt and the trap. Asterisk, asterisk. The boar appeared through the swirling snow like a black nightmare. Its massive form was barely discernible until it drew close enough to attack. But instead of meeting it head-on, Heracles did something unexpected. He retreated, not out of fear but strategically, leading the creature towards a trap he had been preparing for several days. Heracles had noticed that the boar's rage made it predictable. When it saw potential prey, it attacked immediately and directly, never considering that this might be precisely what its opponent desired. By feigning flight, Heracles triggered the creature's pursuit instinct while maintaining control over the chase's direction. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Higher in the mountains, Heracles had discovered a natural hollow filled with deep snow, so deep that even the enormous boar would sink into it and become trapped. The challenge was to reach this hollow while staying ahead of a creature that, despite its size, could run faster than a horse. The chase through the blizzard became an epic test of endurance and navigation. Heracles leaped from rock to rock, slid down snowy slopes, and utilized every advantage the terrain offered. Behind him, the boar tore through the forest like a living avalanche, its rage intensifying with each passing minute that its prey remained out of reach. But Heracles had calculated the distance precisely. Just as his own strength began to wane, he reached the edge of the snowy hollow. Without hesitation, he leaped across the chasm to solid ground on the far side. The boar, driven by pure fury and unable to halt its attack, plunged directly into the deep snow. What followed was almost comical. the great monster that had terrorized an entire region found itself stuck, like a massive, angry piglet. Its rage only exacerbated the situation. Every twitch and struggle drove it deeper into the soft snow. Within minutes, only its head and the tips of its tusks were visible. Asterisk, asterisk. The captured boar. Asterisk, asterisk. But now came the truly difficult part, extracting the creature from the snow and transporting it back to Tyrants without being killed in the process. The trapped boar was still lethally dangerous, and this one was now mad with rage at being outwitted by a mere man. Heracles solved this problem with a combination of engineering and psychology, carefully working around the creature's limited mobility. He built a wooden cage directly around the boar while it was still stuck in the snow. It was painstaking work. Each plank had to be positioned precisely to avoid the slashing tusks. But eventually, he created a mobile prison sturdy enough to contain even this monster. The psychological part came when it was time to dig the boar out of the snow. Instead of simply freeing it into the cage, Heracles continuously spoke to the creature as he worked, not expecting understanding, but hoping that the sound of a calm, steady voice might somehow affect its rage-addled mind. "Easy, friend," he said, shoveling snow away from the boar's massive sides. "I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. Being trapped is frightening, but I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here to give you a chance to be more than just an instrument of destruction." Regardless of whether the Erymanthian boar consciously understood what was happening or merely exhausted itself in a futile struggle, a transformation, astonishing in its essence, occurred during the long and arduous process of its extraction from the snowdrifts. The mighty creature's incessant roars and desperate lunges gradually subsided. By the time Heracles completed the laborious process of clearing the last snowdrifts, the boar was still, silently observing the hero. Its eyes still burned with indomitable anger, yet in their depths, an unexpected flicker of what could well be taken for curiosity emerged. The journey back to Tyrants stretched for many weeks, and this time proved to be a profound lesson for both the hero and the ferocious beast. Heracles understood that even the most furious and untamed creature has needs that extend beyond blind destruction, needs for regular nourishment, secure shelter, and even a semblance of companionship. The boar, for its part, seemed to grasp that not every human is a ruthless enemy who must necessarily be destroyed. By the time they reached the palace, an unprecedented event had occurred. The Erymanthian boar, still confined in its cage but no longer frantically thrashing against the steel bars, allowed Heracles to approach within arm's reach to scratch it behind the ears, like a domestic animal. This creature remained the embodiment of danger. Its tusks could have torn a man apart in mere moments. However, the indomitable, all-consuming rage had given way to a feeling akin to deep calm. Eurystheus, watching from his bronze chamber through a periscope, could hardly believe his own eyes. "How?" he demanded with unconcealed astonishment. "How did you manage to turn this monster into such a docile creature?" Heracles carefully considered the question before giving his answer. "I think that, likely, he was never a true monster. Perhaps he was simply a creature that had suffered and been afraid for so long that rage became his only available way of interacting with the world. When I made him understand that not all life had to be a continuous struggle, he must have remembered the existence of other forms of being." The Erymanthian boar spent its days in a specially constructed enclosure, sprawling in the picturesque royal gardens, where it gradually transformed into a kind of exotic attraction. Children came to feed it ripe apples and delightedly watched it wallow in the mud. It never again displayed the all-consuming destructive rage that had once terrorized the slopes of Mount Erymanthus. However, as Heracles observed this peaceful scene, he could not help but ponder the profound lessons hidden within this extraordinary labor. If even the fiercest and wildest creature can find inner peace when treated with true patience and genuine respect, what does that say about the fundamental nature of man? What conclusions can be drawn regarding the possibility of atonement for one who has committed truly terrible deeds? And perhaps most importantly, as he prepared for a new, even more complex trial, Heracles wondered, what will happen when what needs appeasing is not a bloodthirsty monster, but the corruption and moral filth that inevitably accumulate when people lose all concern for the long-term consequences of their actions? The image of the transformed boar, peacefully grazing in the lush royal gardens, was still vivid in Heracles' memory when Eurystheus summoned the hero for the fifth labor. This time, however, there was something different, unusual in the king's voice, a particular note of malicious satisfaction that unmistakably hinted that this task might prove to be the most humiliating and insulting of all previous ones. "Your next task," Eurystheus solemnly announced from his bronze chamber, his words exuding undisguised malicious glee, "is to clean the stables of King Augus in a single day, every one of them to spotless brilliance." Many might wonder why the simple cleaning of stables could be considered a worthy task for the greatest hero in all of Hellas. However, Eurystheus had thoroughly done his research and was well aware of the full depth of his request. King Augus of Elis possessed countless cattle, surpassing any other ruler in the world. His herds numbered 3,000 head of select cattle, the finest in existence. Yet he had never bothered to clean these stables, not once in 30 whole years. Imagine, if you can, the colossal amount of accumulated filth from 3,000 head of cattle over 3 entire decades. The stables were not merely dirty, they were veritable geological formations of excrement, countless layers of waste that had accumulated until the original floor was completely buried under 10 meters of decomposing organic matter. The unbearable stench carried for miles around, and the countless swarms of flies, continuously circling above the stables, formed dense clouds, visible even from neighboring kingdoms. But the true genius of Eurystheus's cruelty lay in the imposed deadline. Just one day. A task that would have required hundreds of people many months to complete was to be finished from sunrise to sunset by a single man. This was not merely physically impossible. It was designed solely to demoralize, to humiliate the great hero, reducing him to the status of the lowest servant. As Heracles made his journey to Elis, he had ample time for deep reflection on the implications of this labor. His previous tasks had tested his physical strength, fearless courage, formidable patience, and profound wisdom. This one, however, seemed designed solely for his humiliation. But perhaps that was precisely what gave it particular importance. Perhaps learning to find genuine dignity even in the most humble and unassuming work was an integral part of his path to atonement. The unbearable stench reached him long before the stables themselves came into view. The reek was so deep and layered that it seemed to consist of various strata. The sharp, acrid bite of fresh excrement mingled with the earthy richness of decades-old decomposition, and beneath it all lay something so fundamentally rotten that it brought tears to the eyes, and an unbearable nausea. When Heracles finally arrived at King Algius's palace, he found the ruler genuinely embarrassed by his infamous negligence. Augeas was, in many respects, a decent man, generous to his guests, fair to his subjects, and renowned for the quality of his cattle. But somehow the task of cleaning the stables had invariably been put off, and this later had stretched for 30 whole years. "I know how it looks," Augeas said, not quite daring to meet Heracles' gaze as they surveyed the monumental mess together. "I was constantly going to hire people to deal with it, but the job grew to such a scale that I simply didn't know where to begin. And the cost. You know how much it would cost to hire enough labourers to clear all this." Heracles tried to walk through the stables, but it was extremely difficult. In most places the accumulated waste reached almost to the ceiling, leaving only barely discernible narrow passages between towering walls of solidified dung. The cattle themselves had adapted to such conditions, living primarily outdoors and using the stables only in the worst weather. The animals seemed healthy enough, but the waste from their daily activities only exacerbated the already ever-growing problem. Standing amidst this colossal monument to human procrastination, Heracles faced a profound crisis in choosing an approach. His usual methods, brute force, unwavering resolve, and straightforward action would be completely inadequate here. Even if he worked without the slightest rest from the first rays of dawn until sunset, he could not manually clear even 1/10 of this grand mess. This labour demanded an entirely different approach. It required innovation. Heracles spent the rest of the day circling the lands around the stables, studying their geography through the eyes of a shrewd engineer rather than a fearless warrior. He noticed that 2 large rivers, the Alpheus and the Peneus, flowed relatively close to the stables. More importantly, he realized that with some clever earthworks, their courses could be temporarily diverted to flow directly through the neglected and defiled structures. That evening, he outlines his daring plan to King Augeas. "I can clean your stables in a single day," he says, "but I will need help with the preparatory work. Provide me with 50 of your men for the entire night, and by tomorrow evening, your stables will be spotlessly clean." Augeas, desperate after decades of continuous embarrassment, immediately gives his consent. "If you can truly perform this miracle," he says, "I will give you 1/10 of my countless cattle as payment, 300 of the finest animals in all of Greece." Heracles accepts this generous offer, though he is well aware that he cannot actually claim this payment. The labours imposed upon him were meant as penance, not a source of personal gain, but the promise of reward served as an additional incentive for the king to provide the necessary assistance. All night long, Heracles and the 50 labourers dug the earth with such astonishing focus and intensity that it amazed even these men, accustomed to the heaviest toil. They were not merely moving soil, they were altering the very landscape, creating channels capable of redirecting the courses of 2 large rivers towards a single objective. The work was exhausting, but there was something deeply satisfying about it. These men had lived for years feeling shame over their king's neglected stables, unable to solve the problem due to its colossal scale. Now, at last, they were taking decisive action that would forever put an end to this problem. With the first rays of dawn, the final preparations were complete. 2 meticulously designed channels led from the rivers directly to the stables, equipped with massive wooden floodgates ready to regulate the powerful flow. Additional diversion channels at the far end of the structures were to safely carry the water and everything it swept away downstream to agricultural areas where this waste could actually provide immense benefit to the land as rich fertilizer. The moment of truth arrived as the sun reached its zenith. Heracles and his assistants simultaneously threw open the gates, and the combined might of the two rivers surged through the Augean stables like an all-cleansing flood. What happened next was both a captivating spectacle and a source of deep satisfaction. 30 years of accumulated filth were washed away in a matter of hours. The rushing torrent scoured the original floors, exposed walls that had not seen light in decades, and swept away the monumental mess that had seemed utterly impossible to eliminate. But this was not merely an act of destruction, it was true renewal. As the powerful flow of water continued to rush through the stables, it performed something truly remarkable. The ancient accumulation of organic waste, mixing with the fast-flowing river water, was transformed into rich fertilizer that would undoubtedly benefit agricultural lands for miles downstream. What had seemed only an insoluble problem and an embodiment of corruption was turning into something highly useful and beneficial. By midday, the painstaking work was successfully completed. In place of the former stables whose stench, according to legend, could be smelled even in neighboring kingdoms, now stood immaculate structures with stone floors that gleamed radiantly under the sun's rays. The rivers, previously used for the grand cleansing, had been returned to their original courses, leaving behind not just clean, but completely renewed facilities. King Augeas, overcome with immense joy and profound relief, could not hold back his tears. 30 years, he repeated, 30 whole years I lived in this shame, and you have rid me of it in a single day. Without delay, he ordered his men to bring 300 of his finest bulls, thereby keeping his royal promise of payment. However, it was here that Heracles faced an unexpected and very difficult dilemma. He had flawlessly completed his task, strictly adhering to all conditions. The stables shone with cleanliness. All the work had been finished within one day, and its success was achieved predominantly through his own efforts and meticulous planning. But, on the other hand, he had made an agreement with Augeas that brought him personal gain, which seemed to go against the spirit of penance that his labours were meant to symbolize. After long and agonizing deliberation, Heracles made a decision that astonished everyone, including himself. He accepted the offered cattle but immediately distributed them. Some of the bulls went to the labourers who had helped him with the earthworks, while others were given to poor farmers in the surrounding lands who desperately needed livestock to support their families. For himself, he kept absolutely nothing. When news of this act reached Eurystheus, the king's reaction was immediate and entirely predictable. This labour cannot be counted, he declared with inflexibility. Heracles was paid for his work, which makes this deed a mere commercial transaction, not an act of penance. Moreover, he used the rivers for the main part of the cleaning, which means he did not perform the task solely through his own efforts. This was a harsh judgment, its severity compounded by its technical accuracy. But as Heracles was preparing to leave Elis, King Augeas took him aside for a private conversation. "I care nothing for what your cousin says," Augeas said quietly. "What you accomplished here was not just cleaning stables. You showed me that there is no problem that cannot be solved with creativity and diligence. You restored my pride and turned something shameful into something useful. These are the deeds of a true hero." Leaving the gleaming stables, Heracles reflected on the lessons he had learned from this strange labour. Sometimes the most important work is not spectacular or glamorous. Sometimes heroism lies in finding innovative solutions to problems that everyone else deems hopeless. And sometimes the greatest victory is not in the achievement itself, but in the dignity one manages to maintain while doing necessary work. However, returning to Tyrants, he wondered what new trial awaited him. If Eurystheus was becoming increasingly inventive in his cruelty, rejecting completed labours on technicalities, then what impossible trial would test not only his abilities but his very understanding of what it means to serve others? The refusal to count the stable cleaning labour wounded Heracles more deeply than he might have anticipated. As he approached Eurystheus's palace for the 6th time, a new, unfamiliar weariness was evident in his stride. He was beginning to realize that no matter how flawlessly he performed these tasks, his cousin would always find ways to prolong his suffering. But perhaps that was the true meaning. Perhaps true penance cannot be measured by the number of labours completed, but only by the willingness to continue serving, regardless of injustice. From his bronze chamber, Eurystheus's voice emerged with a barely restrained note of excitement. He had been planning this next trial for months, even consulting with Hera herself, to ensure it would test Heracles in ways no previous labour had. "Your 6th labour," the king announced, "is to drive away the Stymphalian birds from the swamps surrounding Lake Stymphalus. These creatures have terrorized the region for years, making it impossible for anyone to live there safely. Now, one might think that birds don't sound particularly threatening, especially after battling monsters like the Hydra and capturing creatures like the Erymanthian boar. However, the Stymphalian birds were no ordinary creatures. They reached the size of cranes but possessed metallic feathers as sharp as sword blades, bronze beaks capable of piercing armour, and a penchant for human flesh that earned them a reputation as the most fearsome predators in all of Arcadia. These birds hunted in flocks numbering in the hundreds, darkening the sky when they took flight. Their metallic feathers could be launched like arrows, raining death from above on anyone unfortunate enough to trespass on their territory. Most terrifying of all, they were intelligent enough to employ strategy, working together to corner prey and using their numerical superiority to overwhelm even well-armed groups of hunters. The journey to Lake Stymphalus led Heracles through increasingly desolate territories. Villages that had once thrived in the region were abandoned. Their inhabitants had fled to safer lands. Farms stood empty, their fields gradually returning to wild growth. Even the roads showed signs of disuse, as travellers had learned to avoid the area entirely. As Heracles approached the lake, the signs of the birds' presence became impossible to ignore. Trees were stripped bare not by the changing seasons but by the constant scratching of metallic talons. The ground was littered with bones, both animal and human, picked clean by bronze beaks. Most disturbing of all, metallic feathers, embedded in tree trunks and scattered across the landscape, gleamed in the sun like a field of knives. The lake itself was a place that, under other circumstances, would have been beautiful. Fed by mountain streams, it was a perfect circle of clear water, surrounded by swamps that should have teemed with wildlife. Instead, it was eerily silent, with only an occasional ripple disturbing the surface. The stillness was so complete that even Heracles' footsteps seemed unnaturally loud. But he knew the birds were there. Somewhere in the dense reeds and tall grasses surrounding the lake, hundreds of deadly creatures watched his approach. He felt there attention as a physical weight, and a shiver ran down his spine from the certainty that he was being assessed as potential prey. Heracles set up camp on a small hill overlooking the swamp, close enough to observe the birds' behavior, but far enough to avoid an immediate attack. As evening fell, he saw for the first time what he was up against. The birds flew out for their evening hunt, like a storm made manifest. They rose from the reeds in a coordinated mass that blotted out the setting sun. Their metallic feathers created a sound like 1,000 swords being sharpened simultaneously. They moved with a precision that spoke of intelligence and long practice, fanning out to cover the entire swamp before beginning their systematic search for food. Watching them work, Heracles began to understand the true scale of his trial. These were not just dangerous animals. This was an organized force that had turned this entire region into its hunting grounds. To fight them directly would be like rushing into a hail of bronze arrows while being attacked by hundreds of flying swords. But the evening observation also revealed something important. The birds' greatest strength could also be their weakness. They moved as a flock, thinking and acting as a collective whole. If he could find a way to disrupt that coordination, scatter them in panic rather than confront them as an organized army, he might have a chance. That night, as Heracles sat by his small fire, an unexpected ally visited him. Athena, the goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare, appeared to him in the flickering flames. She spoke no words, but left behind a gift that would prove essential to his success. It was a pair of bronze castanets, crafted by Hephaestus himself. At first, Heracles did not understand the significance of this gift. Castanets were musical instruments used by dancers and performers. How could they help against a flock of deadly birds? But, examining them more closely, he began to appreciate their divine craftsmanship. When struck together, they produced a sound unlike anything he had ever heard, pure, piercing, and somehow fundamentally unsettling. The next morning, Heracles tested his theory. Standing at the edge of the swamp, he struck the castanets together with all his might. The sound that erupted was extraordinary. Not just loud, but somehow wrong, like the shriek of a creature that should not exist. It echoed across the water and through the reeds with such intensity that it seemed to shake the very air. The effect on the birds was instantaneous and devastating. They erupted from their hiding places in complete panic. Their usual coordination was shattered by the alien sound. Instead of forming their typical hunting formation, they scattered in all directions, colliding with each other and filling the air with confused cries. But Heracles knew this was only the beginning. The sound had scattered the birds, but not driven them away permanently. Once the echoes faded, they would regroup and return, probably more dangerous than before, because now they would be angry as well as hungry. The ensuing event unfolds as one of the most peculiar and ingenious confrontations ever described in the annals of heroic tales. The great Heracles dedicates the entire daylight to tirelessly moving around the vast lake, skillfully employing the castanets to keep the feathered creatures in continuous agitation. Whenever these beings attempt to descend to the ground and restore their orderly formation, the hero forcefully clashes the bronze instruments, plunging them back into utter chaos. Such an endeavor proves to be truly exhausting work, demanding not only colossal physical might but equally matched tactical acumen. Heracles must maintain continuous dynamism, anticipating potential gathering spots for the birds and taking positions that effectively thwart their collective initiatives. The use of the castanets also requires exceptional precision. Striking them too frequently diminishes their impact, while too seldom allows the birds to regain their organization. As the hours passed and the sun began to set, something truly astonishing began to manifest. The continuous stress and pervasive confusion gradually eroded the collective discipline of the feathered creatures. Individual birds, unable to withstand the pressure, began to break away from the main flock, soaring off in search of more serene locales. What had initially appeared as a cohesive armada gradually transformed into a disorganized mass of frightened beings. By evening, the once formidable flock had dwindled to a mere few dozen remaining, and even these last few seemed more preoccupied with escape than with holding their ground. Heracles struck the castanets one last resounding time, and the remnants of the birds soared away towards distant mountain peaks, their piercing cries gradually dissolving into the encroaching silence. The transformation of the marshland proved truly instantaneous and profound. In the absence of the constant threat emanating from the deadly feathered creatures, wildlife began to reclaim its ancestral domains almost immediately. Fish playfully splashed in the lake's waters. Frogs, as if on cue, began their evening, multi-voiced chorus. And even a few cautious deer dared to approach the water's edge to quench their thirst. The natural balance, disrupted for many long years, began to restore itself literally within a few hours. However, the true significance of Heracles' success unfolded in the following days, as news of the birds' ultimate retreat spread throughout the vast region. Farmers, inspired by this news, once again returned to their previously abandoned lands. Travellers fearlessly resumed their journeys along roads that had long lain desolate. And children, who had never before seen the lake except with apprehension, for the first time in their lives played serenely in its crystal-clear waters. Upon his return to Tyrants, Heracles presented several metallic feathers, dropped by the birds in their disordered flight. These trophies served as undeniable proof of his triumph, but also carried a deeper meaning. They were evidence that even the most deeply entrenched and seemingly insurmountable difficulties yield to proper insight, perseverance, and, if necessary, divine assistance. This time King Eurystheus was unable to find even the slightest flaw in the accomplished labour. The feathered monsters had vanished forever. The region had regained its peace, and the task set was successfully completed thanks to Heracles' personal efforts and outstanding ingenuity. The monarch, albeit with clear reluctance, accepted the presented evidence, yet could not deny that the sixth labour had been successfully completed. However, as Heracles prepared to leave the royal chambers, something rather unsettling caught his attention. Eurystheus's evident disappointment, caused by his inability to find any fault whatsoever in the just completed labour, had given way to a new, frightening resolve. The monarch was examining scrolls and maps with such feverish intensity that it unmistakably hinted at an impending trial that promised to be significantly more dangerous than all previous ones. Standing in the palace courtyard and involuntarily listening to snippets of whispers between Eurystheus and his close advisers, Heracles realized his heroic deeds may have taught him valuable lessons, but they were simultaneously teaching his adversaries how to invent increasingly sophisticated and insidious torments. The question that tormented his mind as he left Tyrants was this: what happens when wisdom and fearlessness alone are not enough? What trial is capable of testing not only his physical and mental abilities, but his very perception of the limits of what is possible? The triumphant completion of the Stymphalian bird's mission filled Heracles with a sense of confidence he hadn't felt since the very beginning of his heroic journeys. He had mastered the art of harmonizing brute force with subtle strategy. learned to accept divine assistance with dignity, and found solutions that not only destroyed, but also restored disrupted order. However, as he once again stood before Eurystheus's bronze chamber, the hero sensed that this hard-won wisdom would be put to the test in entirely different, unprecedented ways. "Your seventh labour," Eurystheus announced, and in his voice there were clear notes of barely suppressed biting malice, "will take you far beyond Hellas. You are commanded to travel to the legendary island of Crete and capture the fierce bull that terrorizes King Minos and his subjects. Deliver it here alive and unharmed." At first glance, this task might have seemed straightforward enough. Another mission to capture a beast, akin to the hunt for the Erymanthian boar or the Cyrenaean hind. However, Eurystheus was well aware of the true nature of his commission, and the faint smirk in his voice unmistakably indicated that this undertaking held complexities that would only become apparent when Heracles was fully committed to its execution. The Cretan bull was no ordinary animal. It was the majestic creature that Poseidon himself, lord of the seas, had sent from the ocean depths as a sign of his divine favour to King Minos many years ago. Snow-white, like sea foam, and indescribably beautiful, it was intended as a sacrifice in honour of the formidable god. However, Minos, captivated by its unearthly beauty, dared to keep it for himself, sacrificing a humbler animal in its stead. Poseidon's wrath, provoked by this deception, transformed the bull from a creature of divine grace into something far more menacing. Still striking in appearance, it now possessed incredible power capable of crushing buildings, lightning speed allowing it to outrun racehorses, and a temper so unpredictable that it attacked without the slightest warning or apparent provocation. The sea voyage to Crete provided Heracles with much-needed time for deep reflection on the broader implications of his impending labour. For the first time, his path led beyond mainland Greece, away from familiar lands and long-established support systems. Should he fail, be injured, or require assistance, he would be entirely dependent on strangers in an unfamiliar country. However, this sea journey also granted him something he hadn't experienced for many months: solitude and peace of mind. Standing at the ship's rail and observing the playful dolphins frolicking in the wake, Heracles found himself able to clearly contemplate his journey thus far. Each accomplished deed had taught him something new, and gradually a pattern began to emerge before his inner eye. He was beginning to understand that true heroism was not merely a display of unbridled strength or unparalleled courage. It was deep understanding. An understanding of the nature of the challenges he faced, the needs of the people he served, and the complex, tangled web of motives that drove both almighty gods and simple mortals. This steadily growing wisdom was, perhaps, the most valuable treasure he had acquired in his harsh trials. When Crete finally appeared on the horizon, it was exactly as countless legends described it. The island rose from the sea depths like a precious gem, its snow-white buildings cascading down gentle hillsides to harbours brimming with ships from all corners of the known world. It was the undisputed centre of a maritime empire, a place where cultures merged and innovation flourished with unprecedented vigour. However, even from the ship, eloquent signs of the bull's destructive rampage were visible. A section of the outer city wall was breached, the gaping hole temporarily sealed with wooden barricades. Some structures bore damage that could only have been inflicted by the impact of something. colossal and unstoppable. But most telling was that the streets, usually bustling with life and trade, were now almost empty, as if the entire population was hiding in their homes. King Minos received Heracles in his throne room, which, in all its furnishings, bore witness to unimaginable wealth and unquestionable power. However, the monarch himself was the embodiment of nervous tension, tormented by a problem he could not resolve. Dark circles under his eyes spoke eloquently of many sleepless nights, and his hands trembled almost imperceptibly as he began to describe the dire situation. The bull appears entirely without warning, without any notice, Minos explained, his voice breaking with deep frustration. Sometimes it behaves docilely for several days, peacefully grazing in our fields, but then, for no apparent reason, it suddenly transforms into a force of pure, unbridled destruction. It has leveled 3 barns, destroyed the main bridge leading to the city, and killed 7 of our bravest warriors who tried to subdue it. From Minos's narrative, it became clear that the bull's unpredictability was its most dangerous trait. Unlike other monsters Heracles had already encountered, this creature could not be tracked or its actions anticipated. It could spend an entire week behaving like a perfectly ordinary animal, then suddenly unleash its crushing, all-destroying power upon populated areas. Heracles dedicated several days to carefully observing the bull, maintaining a safe distance, hoping to discern some pattern in its behavior. However, what he ultimately discovered was deeply unsettling. No pattern existed. It seemed the creature switched between serene grazing and frantic, destructive rage, obeying only internal impulses that no outside observer could predict or in any way influence. However, on the 4th day of observations, Heracles witnessed an event that radically changed his perception of the entire situation. He watched the bull peacefully grazing in a meadow when a group of children, disregarding parental warnings, approached to get a closer look at the celebrated creature. Instead of showing aggression, the bull allowed them to come near. It even seemed to enjoy their attention, lowering its colossal head so the little ones could stroke its soft, snow-white muzzle. For almost an hour, this scene remained absolutely peaceful. The children played carefree, essentially with the most dangerous animal in the entire Mediterranean. Then, without the slightest visible external trigger, something inexplicable happened in the bull's behavior. Its eyes, moments ago calm and intelligent, suddenly flared with fierce rage. The children, instinctively sensing the change, fled in panic, while the bull began to smash everything in its path. Trees, boulders, and even the sturdy stone fence that separated the meadow. Observing the metamorphoses occurring in this extraordinary creature, Heracles gradually realized the true nature of the challenge before him. This was not merely a malicious beast, but a creature torn by an internal conflict between its innate divine essence and the pernicious influence of Poseidon's curse. At times the bull displayed its true self, which was inevitably followed by episodes when its natural temperament was suppressed by divine rage. This insight offered the hero a completely different strategy, distinct from a frontal confrontation. Instead of trying to overpower the bull in its moments of frenzy, Heracles decided to approach it during one of its peaceful periods, aiming to sustain this calm state through gentle and attentive handling. The opportunity presented itself 3 days later. The bull was peacefully grazing in a secluded valley, far from any settlements, which eliminated the risk of harm in case of unforeseen circumstances. Heracles approached slowly and openly, avoiding any attempts to hide or resort to deception. He wanted the bull to see him approaching and to decide its reaction independently. The mighty animal raised its head and watched Heracles approach, with an expression that resembled curiosity rather than hostility. When the hero stopped 6 meters away and sat on a comfortable boulder, the bull actually approached him, as if seeking companionship. What followed became one of the most unusual episodes in heroic literature. Heracles and the Cretan bull spent time together with no other purpose than mutual interaction. The hero quietly spoke of his travels, his labors, and his hopes for eventual atonement. The bull listened with all signs of understanding, occasionally making soft sounds that could have been attempts at communication. It was during this peaceful interlude that Heracles made his move, not with ropes or brute force, but with a simple request. "Friend," he addressed the bull, "I need to take you on a journey, not to harm you, but to help both you and the people of this island. Will you come with me willingly?" The bull's response was astonishing. It approached and gently pressed its massive head against Heracles' chest, a gesture of trust that brought tears to the hero's eyes. Without further coercion, the great animal followed Heracles back to the harbor, walking as calmly as a domestic cow. Loading the bull onto the ship bound for mainland Greece became a public celebration. The people of Crete, freed from years of fear, gathered to witness the peaceful departure of the creature that had once held them in terror. Children who just days before had fled in panic now waved goodbye to the bull as if to an old friend. However, the true test of Heracles' approach awaited them during the sea voyage. Confined on the ship, with no room to escape, the bull could become a threat to everyone on board if the violent phase of the curse returned. For 3 days the bull remained calm, seemingly even enjoying the sea breeze and the rhythmic movement of the waves. On the 4th day, however, the inevitable happened. The bull's eyes suddenly flared with the familiar rage, and it began to try to break free from its bonds. But this time, instead of fleeing or preparing for battle, Heracles did something unexpected. He approached the enraged animal and began to hum a quiet, wordless melody that his mother used to sing to him as a child. The effect was gradual but unmistakable. The bull's struggles became less violent. Its breathing slowed, and slowly its eyes returned to their normal, intelligent expression. The divine rage receded, giving way once again to the creature's true nature. When they reached Tyrants, Heracles presented the bull to Eurystheus, not as a captured monster, but as a transformed creature, capable of living peacefully among people. The demonstration proved convincing. The bull allowed itself to be led into a temporary pen and showed no signs of the violence that had terrorized Crete. This time Eurystheus had no grounds to reject the completed labor. The bull had been captured alive and unharmed, delivered to mainland Greece, and handed over in a state that posed no threat to anyone. The 7th labor was undeniably successful. But as Heracles prepared to leave, he could not help but notice the calculating look in his cousin's eyes. The king was beginning to understand that ordinary trials were no longer enough to break his increasingly capable cousin. Whatever came next, it had to test not only Heracles' abilities, but his very soul. Standing in the peaceful courtyard, watching the Cretan bull graze calmly alongside the transformed Erymanthian boar, Heracles reflected on how much he had learned about the power of patience and understanding. But deep in his heart, he knew that these softer lessons were preparing him for trials that would demand all the wisdom he had acquired. The question that haunted him in quiet moments was simple, yet terrible. What happens when understanding and compassion are not enough? What trial can break even a hero who has learned to see the divine spark in every creature he encounters? The sight of the formerly man-eating bull and boar peacefully grazing in Eurystheus's courtyard led the king to a new and troubling understanding of his cousin's developing abilities. Heracles was not merely becoming stronger or more skillful, he was becoming fundamentally different, finding ways to transform monsters into companions. This development threatened everything Eurystheus and Hera hoped to achieve with these labors. From his bronze chamber, the king's voice carried a note of desperate malice. Your 8th labor will take you to Thrace, to the realm of King Diomedes. You must steal his 4 mares and bring them to me. These are no ordinary horses. They are the fiercest creatures alive, and Diomedes feeds them human flesh to maintain their strength and savagery. The implications of this task struck Heracles like a physical blow. For the first time he was being asked to steal, not to capture or kill. More disturbingly, he was being sent to confront creatures that had been deliberately corrupted by the systematic feeding of human sacrifices. This was not about taming monsters or solving problems. This was about confronting pure evil and finding a way to atone for it. But there was another side to this task that troubled Heracles even more deeply. Diomedes of Thrace was known throughout Greece as one of the cruelest tyrants, a man who revelled in torture and treated human life as a mere commodity. The mares were not just dangerous animals, they were instruments of his cruelty. They were fed the flesh of his enemies and innocent victims. Preparing for his journey to Thrace, Heracles made a decision that proved crucial to the outcome of the labor. Instead of traveling alone, he asked his nephew Iolaus and several other young heroes to accompany him. If he was to confront systematic evil, he reasoned, he would need companions who shared his commitment to justice and human dignity. The journey north was sobering. The deeper they penetrated Diomedes' territory, the clearer the signs of his tyranny became. Villages were fortified like military camps, their inhabitants peering fearfully from behind barricaded doors. Roads were patrolled by heavily armed soldiers who eyed travelers with open suspicion. Most disturbing of all, they passed several execution sites where the bones of Diomedes' victims lay scattered and unburied. Diomedes' palace, when they finally reached it, was a fortress built more for intimidation than for beauty. Black stone walls rose sheer from the surrounding plain, topped with iron spikes. The main gates were flanked by the heads of recent victims, left to rot as a warning to anyone who dared to defy the king's will. But it was the steels that truly revealed the horror of what Heracles was to face. Diomedes' 4 mares were kept in a special enclosure, surrounded by 6-meter-high walls. The enclosure reeked of death and decomposition, and the ground was littered with human bones, gnawed clean by equine teeth. The mares themselves were magnificent and terrifying, larger than ordinary horses, with eyes burning with intelligence and malice. Watching the mares feed on fresh meat brought by Diomedes' servants, Heracles realized he was encountering something unprecedented in his labors. These were not creatures corrupted by a divine curse or driven mad by supernatural influence. These were animals that had been systematically perverted by human cruelty. They had been taught to crave the flesh of Heracles' own kind. That evening, as Heracles and his companions made camp outside the city, a group of refugees approached them, people who had escaped Diomedes' tyranny and were now living as outcasts in the wilderness. Their leader, an old man named Abder, told them stories that made even the battle-hardened heroes sick with disgust. He feeds them anyone who displeases him, Abder explained, his voice hollow with memories of terror. Political prisoners, debtors who can't pay, sometimes just people who looked at him wrong. The mares have learned to associate human screams with feeding time. They get excited when they hear people cry out in fear. But Abder, possessing deep knowledge, also provides Heracles with extremely important information about the mare's care and how they should be handled. Despite their deep corruption, these creatures remain horses, retaining their natural needs and instincts. They have food preferences other than human flesh, favored resting places, and individual personality traits. These revelations give Heracles hope that redemption for them is still possible. The plan of action that gradually takes shape during the night's reflections proves to be extremely complex and fraught with great danger. Instead of simply stealing the mares, the heroes decide to attempt to liberate the entire city from Diomedes' tyranny. The despot's death will not only bring freedom to his people, but also eliminate the original source of the mare's corruption. However, this means Heracles will have to fight not only monsters, but an entire system of organized evil. The attack begins with the first rays of dawn, as Heracles and his comrades simultaneously assault the palace and the stables. While the others engage Diomedes' guards in the main square, Heracles alone penetrates the mare's enclosure, carrying not weapons but food, succulent apples and fresh grain, capable of reminding the corrupted horses of their true, inherent nature. The confrontation with these mares proves unlike anything Heracles has ever experienced. These creatures don't just want to kill him, they seek to devour him. They charge, baring their teeth, their eyes burning with cannibalistic hunger. But Heracles does not resist. Instead, he steps sharply aside and scatters the grain and apples on the ground. The mares, expecting to feast on human flesh, are faced with a difficult choice between their acquired taste and their natural instincts. For a moment, they pause in confusion, flaring their nostrils, trying to comprehend the unfamiliar aroma of ordinary horse feed. One of them, perhaps less thoroughly corrupted than the others, cautiously approaches the scattered apples. She sniffs them, then takes a tentative bite. The sweetness seems to awaken something dormant within her. It is a memory of what horses are meant to eat, what they are meant to be. However, this fleeting moment of progress is interrupted by the sudden appearance of Diomedes himself. The tyrant, having broken through the line of defense, storms into the stable complex, consumed with rage over the theft of his precious possessions. In his hand he grips an iron-spiked whip, an instrument he has used countless times to drive the mares to a frenzy of feeding. "You think you can steal from me?" Diomedes roars, raising the whip above his head. "I will feed you to them piece by piece, and they will thank me for the meal." What happens next unfolds swiftly and horribly. Diomedes brings the whip down on Heracles, but the hero catches it with his bare hand. The iron spikes bite deep into his palm, yet he does not release the whip. Instead, he pulls the tyrant towards him, throwing him off balance and rendering him vulnerable. The ensuing struggle is short but decisive. Diomedes, for all his cruelty, is no match for one with Heracles' strength and training. Within moments, the tyrant lies unconscious on the floor of his own stable, surrounded by the mares he had used as instruments of terror. But it is what happens next that defines the true essence of this labor. The mares, seeing their tormentor helpless, approach with obvious intent. They have been taught to perceive human weakness as an invitation to feed, and Diomedes had provided them with countless victims over the years. Heracles faces a terrible choice. He could stop the mares, protecting even this evil man from the fate he had inflicted on so many others. Or he could allow justice to take its natural course, letting the tyrant experience precisely what he had caused his victims to suffer. The decision, when it comes, stems from everything Heracles has learned about the nature of heroism and atonement. He stands between the mares and the fallen tyrant, not to protect Diomedes, but to prevent the horses from further corrupting themselves with human flesh. No, he tells them firmly, spreading his arms to block their path. You are horses, not monsters. You eat grass, grain, and apples, not the flesh of men. Remember who you truly are. The intervention works, partly due to Heracles' commanding presence, and partly because the early taste of apples had reawakened the mare's dormant instincts. They retreat from the unconscious tyrant, though they continue to eye him with obvious hunger. With Diomedes defeated and his guards routed, the liberation of the city happens quickly. Refugees return from the wilderness to reclaim their homes. Political prisoners are freed from the palace dungeons. Most importantly, the systematic feeding of human flesh to the mares immediately ceases. However, Heracles understands that simply removing the source of corruption will not instantly heal creatures that have been perverted for years. The journey back to Tyrants becomes an extended rehabilitation program, during which Heracles and his companions patiently work to re-educate the mares in proper equine behavior. The process is not quick or easy. The mares still display flashes of their former savagery. They still sometimes look at humans with hunger rather than trust. But gradually, with consistent kindness and proper food, they begin to remember who they were meant to be. Young Abder, who had joined their party as an expert in mare care, plays a crucial role in this rehabilitation. He seems to possess an innate understanding of horses, and under his patient guidance, the mares begin to show signs of true healing. By the time they reach Tyrants, the transformation is remarkable. The mares still bear the physical signs of their corruption. They are larger and stronger than ordinary horses, with unusually sharp teeth, but their behavior has become recognizably equine. They graze peacefully, respond to gentle handling, and show no interest in human flesh. Eurystheus, watching from his bronze chamber as the 4 mares are peacefully led into the royal stables, can barely believe what he sees. "How," he demands, "how did you turn man-eaters into ordinary horses?" Heracles carefully considers the question before answering. "I think they were never monsters. They were just creatures taught to be monstrous. When someone showed them another way to live, they gladly chose it. Sometimes evil is not a fundamental nature. Sometimes it's just terrible upbringing that can be corrected with patience and love." But even as he speaks these words, Heracles realizes that his growing ability to rehabilitate corrupted creatures is making his enemies increasingly desperate. The look in Eurystheus's eyes suggests that future labors will test not only his strength or wisdom, but his very commitment to the belief that any creature can be redeemed. And somewhere in the shadows, Hera watches and plots, understanding that direct corruption may not be enough to break this hero who finds light even in the deepest darkness. What trial can shake one who has learned to see the spark of divinity even in the most twisted creations? The sight of Diomedes' former man-eaters peacefully grazing alongside other transformed creatures in the royal stables drove Eurystheus to a new level of frustration. His cousin was not merely completing impossible tasks. He was transforming the very nature of what it meant to be monstrous. If this continued, Heracles might indeed achieve the redemption he sought, something neither Eurystheus nor Hera could allow. This time, when the king's voice echoed from his bronze chamber, it carried a note of calculating cruelty that made even the guards shift uncomfortably. Your 9th labor will test whether your newfound wisdom extends to matters of diplomacy and honor. You must go to the land of the Amazons and procure the golden girdle of their queen Hippolyta. This girdle is a gift from Ares himself, and the queen will not part with it willingly. The implications of this task were immediately clear to Heracles. Unlike his previous labors, which involved creatures that could be fought or negotiated with according to their nature, this task placed him in potential conflict with an entire civilization of warrior women, known for their skill, courage, and fierce independence. The Amazons were not monsters to be tamed or problems to be solved. They were people with their own culture, values, and legitimate right to their property. But there was another aspect of this trial that troubled Heracles even more deeply. Hippolyta's girdle was not merely an ornament. It was a symbol of her power, blessed by the god of war himself. To take it would be akin to stripping the queen of her crown, an act that would humiliate her before her people and potentially destabilize their entire society. Preparing for this journey, Heracles made a decision that reflected how much he had learned from his previous labors. Instead of traveling with warriors who might view the Amazons as enemies to be conquered, he chose companions known for their diplomatic skills and respect for other cultures. This would be a mission of negotiation, not conquest. The journey to the Amazons' homeland led them across the Black Sea to shores that few Greek men had ever seen. As their ship approached the coast, they saw evidence of a civilization unlike anything in their native land. Cities were built with both beauty and defense in mind, showcasing the influence of warrior architects who understood that strength and elegance could coexist. However, the true profound impression on Heracles and his companions was made by their first encounter with the legendary Amazons. A group of warrior horsewomen intercepted their vessel when it was still about a mile from shore. These women moved with filigree precision and unshakable confidence, testament to years of arduous training and absolute faith in their own abilities. Their leader, a stately woman with intricately braided hair and scars, each of which could tell of countless battles, addressed the strangers in Greek, albeit with a noticeable accent, but quite fluently. "I am Antiope, sister of Queen Hippolyta," she proclaimed, and her voice carried the authority of one accustomed to unquestioning obedience. "Explain the purpose of your presence in our waters, Greeks. Have you come here as merchants, envoys, or enemies?" Heracles responded with the courtesy and formal deference befitting an envoy of a sovereign power. "I am Heracles of Thebes, and I have come to meet your queen on a matter of great personal importance to me. I have brought gifts as a sign of deep respect, and ask only for the opportunity to present my plea to her." Such a diplomatic maneuver undoubtedly astonished Antiope, who apparently rarely encountered Greek men capable of addressing Amazons with such dignity and as equals. After a brief deliberation, she granted them unhindered passage to the capital. However, Heracles did not fail to notice that they were accompanied by enough warrior women to thwart any attempt at treachery. The Amazon capital appeared before them as a true revelation. Unlike Hellenic city-states, where women's quarters were usually hidden from public view and attention, here women occupied all key positions of power and enjoyed universal honor. The city's architecture itself eloquently demonstrated their values. buildings, both practical and elegant, were designed by artisans who saw no contradiction between martial prowess and refined aesthetic taste. Queen Hippolyta received them in her throne room, which remarkably combined majestic splendor with cozy proportionality. She was younger than Heracles had expected, perhaps only a few years his senior, but carried herself with the unshakable confidence of one who had never doubted her right to rule. The famous girdle of Ares gleamed at her waist, not ostentatiously or provocatively, but clearly a work of divine art. The dialogue that followed became one of the most remarkable and unconventional in the annals of heroic literature. Instead of making standard demands or offers, Heracles recounted his entire personal story to Hippolyta. The tragic circumstances that led him to undertake these labors, the valuable lessons he had learned from each trial, and his deepening understanding of the true meaning of serving others. Hippolyta listened with the concentration of one accustomed to making responsible decisions, even with incomplete data. When Heracles finished his tale, she began to ask deep, insightful questions that demonstrated both her sharp mind and genuine interest in his spiritual development. "So you seek this girdle not as a trophy won in battle," she concluded, "but as a sign that you have mastered the art of obtaining what you desire through respect, not brute force. You ask me to assist you in proving that you have transformed from the man who once solved every problem with his club." The shrewdness of her judgment astonished Heracles. He himself had not articulated his request in such precise terms, but she had unerringly grasped the profound meaning of what he sought. This labor was not merely a mechanical fulfillment of a task. It was testimony to the fact that Heracles had transformed into a person truly worthy of the atonement he so yearned for. Hippolyta's subsequent actions stunned everyone present, including even her closest advisers. She unclasped the girdle of Ares and, without hesitation, extended it to Heracles. "Take it," she said without a trace of pathos, "not as a trophy won in battle, nor as a bargaining chip, but as a gift freely bestowed in honor of your ascent to wisdom." However, no sooner had Heracles reached for the girdle than catastrophe struck from a completely unexpected quarter. Hera, who had been constantly observing from the heights of Olympus and was furious at such a peaceful outcome, descended into the Amazon capital, taking on the guise of one of the warriors. Moving among the warrior women as one of them, she began to spread malicious rumors that the Greeks had come to abduct their queen, and that Heracles' diplomatic maneuvers were merely a cunning ruse to weaken their vigilant defenses. The consequences were instantaneous and truly devastating. The Amazon warriors, who only moments before had regarded their foreign guests with undisguised curiosity, suddenly saw them as a mortal threat to be immediately neutralized. Swords flew from scabbards, war cries rent the air, and peaceful negotiations rapidly transformed into a frantic, chaotic skirmish. In this general confusion, Heracles found himself facing an insoluble choice. He could use his colossal strength to fight his way out, undoubtedly killing several Amazons in the process. Or he could try to protect Hippolyta, seeking to restore the lost order, thereby risking not only his own life, but the lives of his faithful companions. What he actually did was a vivid reflection of everything he had learned about the true nature of heroism. Instead of drawing a weapon, he threw himself between Hippolyta and the advancing warrior women, using his body as a living shield, and loudly appealed to everyone, urging them to cease the bloodshed. "This is madness," he exclaimed, his voice cutting through the din of battle. We came here with peaceful intentions. Queen Hippolyta honored us with her trust. Do not let the lies of some stranger destroy what we have built together. However, in the mad vortex of battle, words alone were not enough. An Amazonian spear, expertly thrown by a warrior who devoutly believed she was defending her queen, pierced Hippolyta's shoulder. The wound was not fatal, but the sight of their ruler's blood plunged the Amazons into such a furious rage that no rational arguments could now quell it. The battle that followed bore no resemblance to any of Heracles' previous labours. He fought not against monsters or savage animals, but against skilled, battle-hardened warrior women, desperately defending their homeland from what they mistakenly perceived as a mortal threat. Each Amazon he faced was someone's daughter, sister, or loyal friend, an individual with her own hopes, fears, and perfectly valid reasons for fighting. Heracles and his companions fought with desperate restraint, aiming to disable rather than kill their opponents, and trying to create enough free space to retreat rather than striving for complete victory. The Amazons, however, showed no such mercy, convinced they were fighting for their queen's life and the sovereignty of their nation. Ultimately, Hippolyta herself brought an end to the bloody clash. Despite her wound, she struggled to her feet and imperiously commanded her warrior women to cease fighting. "Enough," she exclaimed, and her voice carried the absolute, undeniable authority of a queen. "I freely gave this man my girdle. The attack upon me was treachery arising from within our own ranks, not the machinations of our guests." The Amazons reluctantly lowered their weapons, though many continued to cast suspicious glances at the Greeks. In the sudden silence that fell, Hippolyta approached Heracles, and once again placed the girdle in his hands. Now, however, it was no longer a gift exchanged between friends, but rather compensation for a tragedy imposed upon them both by divine intervention. "Take it and leave our lands," she said softly, and her voice held a deep sadness. "You came here with honor and fought with astonishing restraint when you could have wrought slaughter. But your presence brings chaos my people do not deserve. Perhaps someday, when the gods meddle less in our earthly affairs, we can meet again as friends." The journey back to Tyrants passed in somber silence, overshadowed by deep reflection on how swiftly trust can be undermined and how divine intervention can pervert even the most elevated and noble intentions. Heracles carried Hippolyta's girdle, but it felt incredibly heavy to him, burdened with the weight of missed opportunities and a friendship irrevocably poisoned by forces beyond mortal control. When he finally presented the girdle to Eurystheus, the king accepted it with unconcealed satisfaction. The labor was officially completed by all formal criteria, yet both cousins clearly understood that something profound and irreversible had changed. The easy, almost carefree confidence that Heracles had gradually regained through his recent successes had been shaken by the bitter understanding that even his purest intentions could lead to tragedy when divine malice intervened. Standing in the palace courtyard after completing his 9th labor, Heracles delved into reflection on the lessons hidden within this agonizing experience. He realized that wisdom and good intentions alone are not always enough, that some conflicts arise not from simple misunderstanding, but from deliberate manipulation by forces immeasurably superior to any mortal hero. But perhaps the most important discovery for him was the understanding that sometimes the most heroic act consists of accepting responsibility for consequences that were not desired, to bear the burden of another's pain and to continue one's service even when the gods themselves seem determined to corrupt all your efforts. The question that relentlessly pursued him as he prepared for his 10th labor was this: how to maintain hope and honor when the very forces meant to uphold justice seem intent on destroying it. The weight of Hippolyta's girdle seemed to grow heavier with each passing day after Heracles' return from the Amazon lands. What by all accounts should have been an unqualified triumph now felt like a heavy burden, a constant reminder of how easily divine interference can distort even the purest and most noble intentions. As he approached Eurystheus's palace, preparing for his 10th labor, a previously unknown weariness was evident in his gait. It was the weariness of a man who had come to understand that doing good in a world where gods indulge in their cruel games proves far more difficult than enduring any physical trial. Eurystheus's quiet satisfaction, emanating from the depths of his underground dwelling, undoubtedly testified to his awareness of the turmoil afflicting his royal cousin. Hera's whispers had brought him news of the Amazon incident, and he knew well that Heracles' confidence had been shaken. It is time to present a trial that will push the hero further than he has ever been pushed before, the king proclaimed. Your 10th labor, he announced, will take you to the very ends of the world. You must travel to the island of Erythea, beyond the pillars of Heracles, and steal the cattle of Geryon. These are the finest cattle alive, guarded by monsters and belonging to a being so powerful that even the gods speak of him with respect. The mention of the pillars of Heracles, the majestic rocks that mark the end of the Mediterranean and the beginning of the vast uncharted ocean, made Heracles ponder deeply. This was not just about distance, though the journey would undoubtedly be the longest he had ever undertaken. This was about entering a realm that existed beyond the ordinary world, where different rules applied and familiar protections might prove useless. Geryon himself was a creature of myth and nightmare. Born from the union of divine and monstrous bloodlines, he possessed 3 bodies from the waist up, each with its own head, arms, and independent will. These 3 aspects were not always in harmony with each other, making Geryon both more and less dangerous than an ordinary opponent. One could defeat one of his bodies, only to find the other 2 even more determined to annihilate. However, it was Geryon's herd guardians who posed the most immediate danger. Orthrus, the 2-headed dog, brother to Cerberus himself and almost as deadly. He could attack from 2 directions simultaneously, and his bite carried venom potent enough to fell even divine beings. Then there was Eurytion, the herdsman, a man so skilled with weapons that he never lost a fight, and so devoted to his master that he would rather die than allow anyone to harm the cattle under his care. Preparing for this labor, Heracles faced decisions that would define not only his approach to the immediate trial, but also his understanding of what heroism means in a world where gods constantly interfere in mortal affairs. Should he travel alone, accepting that this might be a suicidal mission? Should he raise an army, turning the labor into a military campaign? Or should he find some middle path that accounts for both his need for success and his growing commitment to minimizing harm to others? The decision he made reflected how much he had learned from his previous labors. He would go to Erythea alone, but he would prepare for the journey with the same meticulousness that had made his recent successes possible. This would not be a reckless charge into danger, but a methodical approach to what might be the most perilous trial he had ever faced. The journey to the Pillars of Heracles led him through lands that grew increasingly strange as he moved further from the familiar territories of Greece. The people he met spoke languages he did not understand, worshipped gods he had never heard of, and followed customs that seemed almost unfathomable to one raised in Greek culture. But it was when he reached the great rocks that marked the edge of the known world that Heracles truly grasped the scale of what he was undertaking. The pillars of Heracles rose like a giant's legs from the wine-dark sea, and beyond them stretched an ocean so vast that it seemed to curve into nothingness. Somewhere in that immense void lay Erythea, and on that island grazed the cattle that represented his 10th labour. The problem of crossing such a distance by ordinary means seemed insurmountable, until Heracles recalled a detail from his childhood lessons. Helios, the sun god, travelled across the sky each day in a golden cup that could float on both air and water. Each evening this cup carried the weary god around the edge of the world to begin his journey anew the next morning. The plan that sprang from this memory was audacious beyond anything Heracles had ever attempted before. He would wait until Helios completed his daily journey, then ask to borrow the sun god's cup for his own voyage to Erythea. It was a request bordering on blasphemy. Mortals did not typically make such demands of major deities, but Heracles had learned that sometimes the impossible becomes possible when approached with proper respect and urgent necessity. The encounter with Helios occurred at sunset on the westernmost rock of the pillars. As the sun god prepared to begin his nocturnal journey around the edge of the world, Heracles approached with the formal courtesy due to a divine being, but also with the confidence of one who had learned to treat the gods as powerful allies, rather than unreachable authorities. "Lord Helios," he said, bowing deeply, but not abasing himself, "I come to you with a request that I know sounds presumptuous. I need to reach the island of Erythea to complete a labour imposed upon me as penance for past misdeeds. Will you lend me your cup for this journey, knowing that I will return it unharmed and treat it with the respect due to divine property?" Helios, perhaps intrigued by the novelty of a mortal making such a direct request, considered the proposition with the attention of one who had seen all the world had to offer. "You ask much, son of Zeus," he said at last. "My cup has never carried a mortal across the waters at the world's edge, but I have watched your labours with interest and approve of what you have learned of service and sacrifice. Very well. You may borrow my cup, but only for 3 days. If you do not return by then, you will be stranded in waters no mortal was meant to sail." Helios's golden cup was a marvel that defied all assumptions about how boats should work. It responded to thought, not physical steering, moved by divine power rather than wind or oar, and somehow protected its passenger from the crushing forces that should have annihilated any mortal who dared to venture into the realm of the gods. The journey across the outer ocean was unlike anything Heracles had ever experienced. Here, at the edge of creation, ordinary rules seemed to be suspended. Sea creatures the size of islands surfaced alongside the cup, showing no interest in this strange visitor to their domain. The water itself seemed alive, with currents of light and darkness that followed patterns no mortal mind could comprehend. But it was when Erythea appeared on the horizon that Heracles truly understood what he was facing. The island was not just a piece of land. It was a world unto itself, with its own weather, its own laws of nature, and its own relationship with the divine forces that shaped reality. Geryon's cattle grazed on grass that glowed with an inner light, drank from streams that flowed uphill, and moved with a grace that spoke of creatures touched by power beyond the mortal realm. First came the confrontation with Orthrus, as Heracles expected. The two-headed dog emerged from the mystical landscape like a piece of living shadow, each head snarling with fury at this intrusion into its master's domain. But Heracles had learned a lesson from his battle with the Hydra, and he knew that multi-headed creatures required different tactics than ordinary foes. Instead of trying to fight both heads at once, Heracles used his speed and intellect to keep them focused on each other. By positioning himself so that each head had to attack through the other's line of sight, he turned Orthrus's advantage into a disadvantage. The dog became confused, unsure which head should lead the attack, and in that moment of hesitation Heracles struck with his club. The defeat of Orthrus caused Eurytion to flee, and here Heracles faced a different kind of trial. The herdsman was not a monster to be vanquished or a creature to be tamed. He was a man doing his job, protecting property that rightfully belonged to his master. The ensuing battle was between two skilled warriors, each committed to his own sense of duty. But Heracles had learned an important lesson from his encounter with the Amazons. Sometimes the most honourable approach is also the most practical. Instead of trying to kill Eurytion, he focused on disarming the herdsman and creating enough space to accomplish his mission without unnecessary bloodshed. The confrontation with Geryon himself proved to be the strangest battle in Heracles' career. Fighting an enemy with three bodies required constant adaptation, as each aspect of the monster brought different strengths and strategies to the fight. One body might be skilled with weapons, another might rely on brute force, and a third might employ cunning and disorientation. But Heracles had learned to observe his enemies carefully, and he noticed something important about Geryon's nature. The three bodies were not always perfectly coordinated. Sometimes they acted at cross purposes, each trying to implement its own strategy without consulting the others. This lack of perfect unity became the key to victory. By forcing Geryon to fight in a confined space where the three bodies impeded each other's movements, Heracles turned the monster's greatest strength into a weakness. The battle ended not with a dramatic final blow, but with Geryon collapsing from exhaustion and incoordination, his three aspects too weary and confused to continue fighting effectively. The cattle drive and the return journey to the shores of mainland Greece themselves become a true epic. These animals are not mundane creatures. Endowed with divine origin, they demand exceptional care and unceasing vigilance. The journey back, fraught with herding a mystical herd of cows across vast continental expanses, bypassing numerous bandit gangs and terrifying monsters inevitably drawn to such valuable possessions, becomes a test of all the skills Heracles has acquired. However, it is during this long journey home that Heracles comes to an epiphany that will influence all his subsequent labours. Geryon's cows, despite their mysterious nature, are in essence peaceful creatures. They do not seek battle or to cause anyone distress. Their sole desire is to graze peacefully and live in harmony with their true essence. The violence that surrounds them does not stem from their own temperament, but from the conflicts engendered by the desire to possess such precious property. When Heracles finally presents the cattle to Eurystheus, the king's reaction is immediate and strikingly candid. Instead of keeping the animals for himself, he orders them sacrificed to Hera, turning what should have been a triumph of successful completion into a ritual of divine appeasement. The cattle that had peacefully followed Heracles across continents and oceans are destroyed to please the very goddess who orchestrated all his suffering. Standing in the royal courtyard and watching the smoke rise from the sacrificial pyres, Heracles comes face to face with a bitter truth he had previously avoided. His labours are not truly about completing tasks or proving his own valor. Their true purpose is to sate Hera's insatiable thirst for vengeance, and no success or wisdom will ever truly satisfy her desire for his humiliation. Such a realization might have crushed the old Heracles, but the hero who had travelled to the ends of the earth and back had gained profound wisdom regarding the nature of service and sacrifice. Sometimes the most significant victories remain invisible to those who pass judgment, and sometimes the greatest heroism is displayed in continuing to serve, even when those for whom you make your sacrifice prove unworthy of it. Preparing for his 11th labour, Heracles possesses not only the experience of his latest triumph, but also a deeper understanding of what he is truly fighting for. Eurystheus's approval, or even Hera's forgiveness, is not what matters. What matters is the knowledge that he is transforming, becoming someone worthy of the redemption he seeks, regardless of whether anyone else recognizes this internal transformation.